Peter the Hermit's departure for the east did not diminish the crusading fervor in Germany. He left his follower, Gottschalk, behind to gather another army, and numerous other preachers and leaders were ready to follow his lead. Although many Germans responded to the call by the thousands, they were less eager than the French to rush to the Holy Land. There were pressing matters to address closer to home first. For centuries, Jewish communities had settled along the trade routes of Western Europe. These Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors had spread from the Mediterranean during the Dark Ages, maintained strong ties with fellow Jews in Byzantium and the Arab world. This network allowed them to play a significant role in international commerce, particularly in trade between Muslim and Christian territories. With usury forbidden in Western Christian lands and tightly regulated in Byzantium, Jews had a unique opportunity to establish money-lending businesses across Christendom. Their expertise and long-standing traditions also made them highly respected in the field of medicine. Except for ancient times in Visigothic Spain, they had rarely faced serious persecution in the West. Although they lacked civil rights, both secular and church authorities generally protected them due to their economic usefulness. The monarchs of France and Germany were often supportive, and the archbishops of major Rhineland cities extended special favor to them. However, resentment against the Jews grew among peasants and poorer townspeople, who increasingly found themselves indebted to them as the monetary economy replaced the older system of service obligations. Without legal safeguards, the Jews charged high interest rates and profited greatly wherever local rulers offered them protection. Throughout the 11th century, their unpopularity continued to rise as more social groups borrowed money. The crusading movement further intensified these tensions. Knights preparing for crusade faced substantial expenses. If they lacked land or assets to offer as collateral, they often turned to Jewish lenders. Many questioned whether it was just to become financially dependent on those seen as responsible for Christ's crucifixion in order to fight for Christianity. Poorer Crusaders, already burdened by debts to Jews, wondered if such obligations hindered their sacred duty. Crusade preachers emphasized Jerusalem, the site of Christ's crucifixion, inevitably drawing attention to those blamed for his death. While Muslims were the current adversaries for persecuting Christians, Jews were viewed by many as even greater enemies, for they had persecuted Christ himself. In previous campaigns in Spain, some Christian soldiers had already begun to mistreat Jewish communities. During the Barbastro expedition, Pope Alexander II reminded Spanish bishops that Jews and Muslims were not the same. The Muslims were sworn enemies of Christianity, but the Jews were willing to serve Christian rulers. Nonetheless, because Jews in Spain had long enjoyed favorable treatment under Muslim rule, the Christian conquerors struggled to place their trust in them. In December 1095, the Jewish communities of northern France sent warnings to their fellow Jews in Germany, alerting them that the crusading movement might bring danger to their people. Rumors circulated of a massacre of Jews in Rouen. Although it's unlikely such a massacre actually occurred, the reports were alarming enough for Peter the Hermit to seize a profitable opportunity. Suggesting that he might struggle to restrain his followers otherwise, he secured letters of introduction from the French Jews, addressed to Jewish communities across Europe, urging them to welcome him and supply his army with any necessary provisions. Around the same time, Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, began his own preparations for the crusade. A rumor spread throughout the region that he had sworn to avenge Christ's death by shedding Jewish blood before his departure. In fear, the Jews of the Rhineland persuaded Kalonymos, the chief rabbi of Mainz, to appeal to Emperor Henry IV to intervene and prevent any violence. At the same time, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne, seeking extra security, each offered Godfrey 500 pieces of silver. Henry wrote to his leading vassals, both secular and religious, ordering them to ensure the safety of the Jews in their territories. Having already extorted payment, Godfrey declared that persecution was not on his mind and willingly granted the requested guarantee of protection. But any hope the Jews had of escaping Christian fanaticism so easily was soon shattered. At the end of April 1096, a man named Volkmar departed from the Rhineland with over 10,000 men, intending to join Peter's forces in the east. He traveled through Bohemia along the route to Hungary. A few days later, Peter's former disciple Gottschalk set out with an even larger group, following Peter's original path up the Rhine and through Bavaria. Meanwhile, a third force had gathered under a minor Rhineland noble, Count Emich of Leasingen, who was already notorious for lawlessness and banditry. Emich claimed to have miraculously received a cross branded on his flesh, and his military experience attracted a more diverse and formidable following than either Volkmar or Gottschalk could command. His army included simple, zealous pilgrims as well as members of the French and German nobility, such as the lords of Zweibrücken, Somme, Wernenberger, Hartmann of Dillingen, Drogo of Nessel, Clarenbald of Vondel, Thomas of La Fere, and William, Viscount of Melun, known as the Carpenter for his immense strength. It may have been the examples of Peter and Duke Godfrey that inspired Emich to see how easily religious zeal could serve personal gain. Disregarding the Emperor Henry's explicit orders, he convinced his followers to launch their crusade on May 3rd by attacking the Jewish community of Speyer, near his own lands. The assault, however, was not particularly successful. The Bishop of Speyer, who had been won over by a generous gift, placed the Jews under his protection. Only 12 Jews were seized and killed after refusing to convert to Christianity, and one Jewish woman took her own life to protect her honor. The bishop saved the remaining Jews and even apprehended several of the murderers, who had their hands cut off as punishment. Though the massacre at Speyer had been relatively small, it fueled further violence. On May 18th, Emich and his forces arrived in Worms. Not long after, a rumor spread that the Jews had abducted a Christian, drowned him, and used the water from his corpse to poison the city's wells. The Jews were already unpopular in Worms and the surrounding countryside, and the rumor quickly incited townspeople and peasants to join Emich's troops in attacking the Jewish quarter. Every Jew who was captured was executed. As in Speyer, the local bishop tried to intervene, offering his palace as a refuge for the Jews. But Emich and the mob forced their way through the gates and stormed the sanctuary. Despite the bishop's protests, they slaughtered all the Jews under his protection. This massacre occurred on May 20th. 5 days later, on May 25th, Emich arrived at the gates of Mainz. Archbishop Rothhard had ordered the gates closed against him, but word of Emich's approach sparked anti-Jewish riots within the city. During the unrest, a Christian was killed, and on May 26th, sympathizers inside the city opened the gates to Emich and his men. The Jewish community, gathered at the synagogue, sent gifts of 200 silver marks to both the archbishop and the leading noble of the city, pleading to be sheltered in their palaces. A Jewish envoy also approached Emich, paying him 7 gold pounds in exchange for a promise of protection. But this bribe proved useless. The following day, Emich attacked the archbishop's residence. Alarmed by the growing violence, Rothhard fled with his entire household. With the bishop gone, Emich's forces stormed the palace. Though the Jews attempted to defend themselves, they were quickly overpowered and killed. Their lay protector showed more resistance, but Emich managed to set fire to his residence, forcing everyone inside to evacuate. Some Jews survived by renouncing their faith, while those who refused were slain. The massacre continued for 2 more days, as fleeing Jews were hunted down. Some who had initially converted later regretted their decision and took their own lives. One man, before killing himself and his family, set fire to the synagogue to prevent it from being desecrated. The chief rabbi, Kalonimos, escaped with about 50 others to Ridsheim and sought refuge with the archbishop, who was staying at his country retreat nearby. Seeing the terror on their faces, the archbishop took the opportunity to try to convert them. This was too much for Kalonimos. He grabbed a knife and attacked his host, but was quickly subdued. The assault sealed his fate and that of his companions. By the end of the Mainz massacre, around 1,000 Jews had lost their lives. Emich then turned toward Cologne. Anti-Jewish violence had already erupted there in April, and when news of the Mainz massacre reached the city, the Jews fled in panic. They hid in nearby villages and in the homes of Christian acquaintances, who sheltered them over Whitsunday, June 1st, and the following day while Emmek's forces were in the area. Although the synagogue was burned and a Jewish man and woman who refused to convert were killed, the archbishop's authority helped to prevent further bloodshed. At Cologne, Emmek decided that his mission in the Rhineland was complete. In early June, he set out with the majority of his forces, marching along the main river towards Hungary. However, a significant group of his followers believed that the Moselle Valley also needed to be cleansed of Jews. Breaking away from Emmek's main army at Mainz, they arrived at Trier on June 1st. Most of the Jewish community there found refuge in the archbishop's palace. Yet, as the Crusaders approached, some Jews, overcome with fear, began fighting among themselves, while others threw themselves into the Moselle River and drowned. The attackers then advanced to Metz, where 22 Jews lost their lives. Around mid-June, they returned to Cologne hoping to reunite with Emmek, but upon finding him gone, they continued down the Rhine. Between June 24th and 27th, they carried out massacres of Jewish communities in Neuss, Wevelinghofen, Eller, and Xanten. Afterward, the group dispersed. News of Emmek's brutal campaign soon reached other groups who had already departed Germany for the east. Volkmar and his followers arrived in Prague at the end of May. On June 30th, they began a massacre of the local Jewish population. The secular authorities were unable to control the violence, and the fervent objections of Bishop Cosmas were ignored. From Prague, Volkmar continued into Hungary. At Nitra, the first major town after crossing the border, he likely attempted similar actions. However, the Hungarians refused to tolerate such conduct. They attacked and dispersed the Crusaders, killing many and capturing others. What became of the survivors, or of Volkmar himself, remains unknown. Meanwhile, Gottschalk and his men, who had taken a route through Bavaria, paused in Ratisbon to slaughter the Jews there. A few days later, they crossed into Hungary at Wieselburg, Mosen. King Kaloman permitted them to restock supplies provided they maintained good behavior. But from the beginning, they began looting. The Hungarian peasants resisted these thefts, leading to violent clashes. Several people were killed, and a young Hungarian boy was impaled by the Crusaders. In response, King Kaloman mobilized his troops, surrounding the Crusaders at Stolweisenberg, further east. The Crusaders were forced to surrender their weapons and all stolen goods. Yet the unrest did not end there. Whether they tried to resist or whether Kaloman, having heard of the violence at Nitra, simply no longer trusted them, is uncertain. At his command, the Hungarian army attacked. Gottschalk attempted to flee, but was quickly captured. His entire force was slaughtered in the massacre. A few weeks later, Emmek's army approached the Hungarian border. It was larger and far more formidable than Gottschalk's force, and King Kaloman, mindful of recent events, grew increasingly concerned. When Emmek requested permission to cross through Hungary, Kaloman denied his appeal and dispatched troops to guard the bridge spanning a branch of the Danube at Wieselburg. Yet Emmek refused to be deterred. For 6 weeks, his forces engaged the Hungarians in a series of small skirmishes near the bridge while they worked on constructing a separate crossing of their own. During this period, they ravaged the countryside on their side of the river, plundering supplies and livestock. Eventually, the Crusaders completed their makeshift bridge, crossed the waterway, and laid siege to the fortress of Wieselburg. Well-armed and equipped with powerful siege engines, their assault made the town's fall appear inevitable. However, rumors soon spread that King Kaloman was approaching with a full army. Panic swept through the Crusaders' ranks, throwing them into disarray. Seizing the opportunity, the fortress garrison launched a sudden attack against the Crusader camp. Emmek was unable to restore order. After a brief battle, his forces were completely defeated. Most of his men perished on the battlefield, though Emmek himself, along with a handful of knights, managed to escape thanks to the speed of their horses. While Emmek and his German followers returned home, the French knights joined other expeditions heading toward Palestine. The collapse of Emmek's crusade, coming so soon after the failures of Volkmar's and Gottschalk's campaigns, left a strong impression on Western Christendom. To many devout Christians, these defeats were seen as divine punishment for the slaughter of the Jews. Others, who had always viewed the entire crusading venture as misguided, interpreted these disasters as God's clear rejection of the movement. So far, nothing had occurred to justify the battle cry first heard at Clermont, Deus lo volt. The Western princes who had taken up the cross were far less impatient than Peter and his followers. They were willing to follow the Pope's timetable. Their armies needed to be assembled and equipped, funds had to be secured, and arrangements made for the governance of their territories during an absence that could last for years. None of them intended to set out before the end of August. The first to depart was Hugh, Count of Vermandois, known as Lemaine, a title inaccurately translated by contemporary Latin chroniclers as Magnus. He was a younger son of King Henry I of France and Anne of Kiev, a princess of Scandinavian descent. Around 40 years old, Hugh held higher rank than wealth, having acquired his small county through marriage to its heiress, and had never played a significant role in French politics. Proud of his noble lineage, but lacking in effectiveness, his reasons for joining the crusade remain unclear. Perhaps he had inherited the restlessness of his Scandinavian forebears, or he hoped to gain in the East the power and riches worthy of his birth. His brother, King Philip, likely encouraged his decision as a way to strengthen the family's ties with the papacy. Leaving his lands in the care of his countess, Hugh departed in late August for Italy with a modest force composed of his vassals and some knights from his brother's domains. Before setting out, he dispatched a special messenger ahead to Constantinople, requesting that the emperor arrange for his arrival to be treated with the honors befitting a royal prince. As he traveled south, he was joined by Drogo of Nesle, Clarembald of Vendôle, William the Carpenter, and other French knights returning from Emmek's failed campaign. Hugh and his companions passed through Rome and reached Bari in early October. In southern Italy, they encountered Norman princes also preparing for the crusade. Bohemond's nephew, William, chose not to wait for his relatives and decided to cross the sea alongside Hugh. From Bari, Hugh sent an advance party of 24 knights, led by William the Carpenter, to Dyrrhachium to inform the local governor of his impending arrival and to reiterate his request for a reception befitting his status. The governor, John Comnenus, was thus able to alert the emperor and prepare to receive him. However, Hugh's arrival did not go as grandly as he had planned. A storm wrecked the small fleet he had hired for the crossing. Some ships sank with all on board. Hugh himself was washed ashore at Cape Pally, a few miles north of Dyrrhachium. John's envoys found him there, disheveled and shaken, and escorted him to their governor. John Comnenus promptly provided Hugh with fresh supplies, entertained him lavishly, and extended every courtesy. While Hugh was pleased by the outward show of respect, some of his followers felt he was being held captive. Hugh remained in Dyrrhachium until a senior official, Admiral Manuel Butamites, arrived to escort him to Constantinople. His journey was comfortable, though he was forced to take a detour through Philippopolis, as the emperor wished to prevent him from coming into contact with the many Italian pilgrims traveling along the Via Egnatia. Upon his arrival in Constantinople, Emperor Alexius warmly welcomed him, showered him with gifts, yet continued to restrict his movements. Hugh's arrival prompted Alexius to clarify his stance toward the Western princes. Drawing on both intelligence he had gathered and his own memories of Roussel of Balliol's ambitions, Alexius became convinced that, regardless of the Crusades' official religious justification, the true aim of the Franks was to carve out their own principalities in the East. This, however, did not trouble him. As long as the empire regained the territories it had lost to the Turks, there were clear advantages to the creation of Christian buffer states along its borders. At the time, the idea that small states could exist independently was not commonly accepted. Alexius wanted to ensure that any such new realms would acknowledge him as their overlord. Understanding that Western custom established loyalty through a formal oath, he resolved to require one from each of the Crusader leaders, binding them to him regarding any future conquests. To gain their cooperation, he was prepared to offer lavish gifts and subsidies, showcasing his wealth and grandeur so they would not feel that swearing allegiance to him diminished their status. Hugh, captivated by the emperor's splendor and generosity, readily agreed to Alexius's terms. But the next leader to arrive from the west proved more resistant. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, would later be celebrated in legend as the ideal Christian knight. However, a careful reading of history paints a more nuanced picture. Born around 1060, he was the second son of Count Eustace II of Bouillon and Ida, the daughter of Godfrey II, Duke of Lower Lorraine. Through his mother's lineage, Godfrey was distantly descended from Charlemagne. Though originally designated as heir to his maternal grandfather's lands, the Emperor Henry IV seized the duchy upon the elder Godfrey's death, leaving the young noble only with the county of Antwerp and the lordship of Bouillon in the Ardennes. Godfrey nevertheless remained loyal to Henry, serving him faithfully in his campaigns across Germany and Italy. As a result, in 1082, Henry granted him the duchy. Lorraine, influenced deeply by Cluniac reformist ideals, may have created internal tension for Godfrey, who may have begun to experience conflict between imperial service and the growing pull of papal devotion. His rule over Lorraine was not notably effective, and it is likely that Emperor Henry had doubts about his continued service. Godfrey's decision to join the crusade was likely driven by a combination of factors: concern about his political future in Lorraine, spiritual uncertainty, and a genuine religious calling. He took careful steps to prepare. After extorting money from the Jewish population, he sold the estates of Rosy and Steny along the Meuse River and mortgaged his castle of Bouillon to the Bishop of Liège. These efforts enabled him to raise and equip a substantial army. His military command, combined with his former ducal title, gave him considerable prestige. He was tall and well-built, with fair hair and a yellow beard, fitting the image of the ideal northern knight. Yet despite his noble bearing, he was not a particularly skilled commander, and his younger brother Baldwin often outshone him in both ability and influence. Godfrey's two brothers had also taken up the cross. The elder, Eustace III, Count of Bouillon, was a reluctant participant in the crusade, eager to return to his prosperous estates that spanned both sides of the English Channel. His contribution of soldiers was much smaller than Godfrey's, and he was therefore content to accept his brother's leadership. He likely traveled separately, choosing a route through Italy. The younger brother, Baldwin, who traveled alongside Godfrey, was of a very different character. Originally intended for a church career, Baldwin had not been granted any of the family estates. Although his education at the prestigious school in Reims gave him a lasting appreciation for culture, his temperament was not suited for the clergy. He returned to secular life and appears to have entered his brother's service in Lorraine. The brothers presented a striking contrast. Baldwin was even taller than Godfrey. His hair was dark, while Godfrey's was fair. His skin was pale, almost white. Godfrey was known for his gracious demeanor, while Baldwin was proud and aloof. Godfrey lived simply, though Baldwin had a strong fondness for grandeur and luxury. While Godfrey maintained a chaste personal life, Baldwin was known for his indulgence in sensual pleasures. Baldwin embraced the crusade with enthusiasm, seeing in it the opportunity that his homeland could not offer. He set out accompanied by his Norman wife, Godfrey of Tosny, and their young children, fully intending not to return. Godfrey and his brothers were joined by many prominent knights from Walloon and Lotharingian lands. Among them were their cousin Baldwin of Rethel, Lord of Labourg, Baldwin II, Count of Hainaut, Raymond, Count of Toul, Warner of Grey, Dudo of Consarberg, Baldwin of Stavelot, Peter of Steny, and the brothers Henry and Geoffrey of Esch. Possibly feeling uneasy about his loyalty to the emperor while dealing with the papacy, Godfrey chose not to follow the route through Italy taken by the other Crusader leaders. Instead, he decided to travel through Hungary, following not only the path taken by the earlier popular Crusades, but also, as legends spreading throughout the West suggested, retracing the steps of his ancestor Charlemagne on his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Departing from Lorraine at the end of August, Godfrey and his forces marched for several weeks along the Rhine and down the Danube, reaching the Hungarian border at the Lethe River in early October. From there, he dispatched an embassy led by Geoffrey of Esch, to request permission from King Coloman to cross his realm. King Coloman, still wary after suffering greatly at the hands of previous Crusader groups, was hesitant. He detained the envoys for 8 days before proposing a meeting with Godfrey at Oldenburg. Godfrey arrived with a small retinue and was hosted for several days at the Hungarian court. Impressed by Godfrey during the visit but cautious nonetheless, Coloman agreed to allow the Crusaders passage on the condition that Baldwin remain as a hostage, along with Baldwin's wife and children. When Godfrey returned to his army, Baldwin at first resisted the demand but eventually agreed. With the hostages secured, Godfrey and his forces entered Hungary at Oldenburg. Coloman promised to supply provisions at fair prices, while Godfrey ordered his heralds to proclaim that any acts of violence would be punished by death. With these precautions in place, the Crusaders proceeded peacefully through Hungary, under the watchful eye of the king and his forces. After a 3-day stop at Mangelas, near the Byzantine border, to resupply, Godfrey reached Semlin toward the end of November. There, he led his troops across the Save River to Belgrade in an orderly fashion. Once safely across, the hostages were released and returned to him. The imperial authorities, likely alerted in advance by the Hungarians, were prepared to receive Godfrey. Belgrade had remained abandoned since it was plundered by Peter's forces 5 months earlier. However, a frontier guard was quickly dispatched to Niš, where Governor Nicetas was stationed and an escort for Godfrey was already waiting. The escort promptly set out and met Godfrey's army in the Serbian forest, roughly halfway between Belgrade and Niš. Arrangements for the army supplies had already been made, allowing the troops to continue their journey through the Balkan Peninsula without incident. While passing through Philippopolis, news reached the army of Hugh of Vermandez's arrival in Constantinople and the extraordinary gifts he and his companions had received. This report impressed Baldwin of Hainaut and Henry of Esch so much that they decided to hurry ahead of the army, hoping to claim their share of the imperial generosity before others arrived. However, there were also unsettling rumors that Hugh was being held against his will. This left Godfrey uneasy. Around December 12th, Godfrey's forces stopped at Salimbria on the shore of the Sea of Marmara. Up to that point, discipline within the army had been excellent, but it suddenly collapsed. For 8 days, the soldiers looted the surrounding countryside. The cause of this outbreak remains unclear, though Godfrey tried to justify it as retaliation for Hugh's supposed imprisonment. Emperor Alexius responded swiftly, sending 2 Frenchmen in his service to reason with Godfrey and convince him to resume a peaceful march. Their efforts succeeded, and on December 23rd, Godfrey's army reached Constantinople. At the emperor's request, they established camp outside the city, along the upper reaches of the Golden Horn. Godfrey's arrival with a large, well-equipped force posed a significant challenge for the Byzantine administration. In line with his broader strategy, Alexius aimed to secure Godfrey's loyalty as quickly as possible and move him away from the volatile proximity of the capital. Although Alexius may not have genuinely believed, as his daughter-in-law later claimed, that Godfrey harbored ambitions of seizing Constantinople, the risks were real. The suburbs had already suffered damage from Peter the Hermit's unruly followers. Allowing another powerful and better-armed force to remain nearby was dangerous. But before anything else, Alexius needed Godfrey's oath of fealty. Once Godfrey's army had settled into its camp, Hugh of Vermandois was dispatched to visit him and encourage him to meet with the emperor. Far from holding a grudge for his earlier treatment, Hugh accepted the task willingly. However, Godfrey declined Alexius's invitation. He was uncertain and cautious. Hugh's cooperative attitude confused him. Meanwhile, his soldiers had begun mingling with survivors of Peter's earlier expedition, many of whom blamed their failure on betrayal by the Byzantines. These accounts influenced Godfrey's perception. As Duke of Lower Lorraine, he had already sworn allegiance to Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, and may have felt that pledging loyalty to the Eastern Emperor would be inappropriate or disloyal. Additionally, he preferred to delay any significant decision until the other Crusade leaders, whose arrival was imminent, could be consulted. He returned to Alexius without a response. Alexius reacted with anger and made the ill-judged decision to pressure Godfrey by cutting off the supplies he had promised for his army. While Godfrey remained indecisive, Baldwin immediately began raiding the nearby suburbs, prompting Alexius to lift the blockade. In response, Godfrey agreed to relocate his camp further down the Golden Horn to Pera, where it would be more sheltered from the winter weather. For a time, tensions eased. The emperor resumed provisioning the western troops adequately, and Godfrey ensured order was maintained among his men. At the end of January, Alexius once again extended an invitation for Godfrey to come to the palace, but Godfrey was still unwilling to commit until more of the crusading leaders had arrived. Instead, he sent Baldwin of Loubourg, Conon of Montaigu, and Geoffrey of Esch to hear the emperor's terms. Yet when they returned, Godfrey gave no response. Alexius, hoping to avoid another outbreak of violence against his suburbs, refrained from taking any provocative actions. He isolated the Lorrainers from external contact and waited patiently, expecting Godfrey to grow restless and agree to his conditions. By late March, Alexius received word that other Crusader forces were nearing Constantinople. Realizing the urgency of the situation, he chose to escalate pressure and gradually reduce the supplies sent to Godfrey's camp. First, the horses were left without fodder. Then, as Holy Week drew near, fish rations were stopped. This provocation sparked renewed aggression from the Crusaders, who began launching daily raids into surrounding villages. Eventually, they clashed with the Pecheneg troops assigned as local enforcers. In retaliation, Baldwin ambushed the patrols, capturing 60 and executing many of them. Buoyed by this limited success and feeling there was no turning back, Godfrey resolved to take more drastic action. After looting and burning the homes in Pera where his men had been staying, he led his forces across a bridge at the head of the Golden Horn and positioned them outside the city walls. There, they launched an assault on the gate leading to the palace quarter of Blacherney. It's uncertain whether Godfrey truly intended to breach the city or merely pressure Alexius into negotiations. But the Byzantines feared a full-blown coup. It was Holy Thursday, April 2nd, and the capital was caught off guard by the sudden aggression. Panic began to spread among the population, calmed only by the presence and composed demeanor of the emperor himself. Deeply disturbed by the need to fight on such a sacred day, Alexius ordered a show of force outside the gates, instructing his soldiers not to engage in direct combat. Archers on the walls were told to fire above the heads of the Crusaders. Godfrey's troops didn't push the attack and soon withdrew, having killed only 7 of the imperial guards. The following day, Hugh of Vermandois approached Godfrey again to urge restraint. But Godfrey rebuked him, mocking his willingness to submit so readily as a vassal. Later that day, Alexius sent another delegation to propose that Godfrey's army cross over to Asia even before he formally swore allegiance. The Crusaders, however, didn't wait to hear them out and charged toward the messengers. Seeing that diplomacy had failed, Alexius ordered a more serious military response. The well-trained Byzantine soldiers easily repelled the Crusaders. After a short engagement, Godfrey's forces were routed and forced to flee. This defeat brought Godfrey to a reluctant realization of his vulnerable position. At last, he agreed to swear the oath of allegiance to the emperor and accepted transportation for his army across the Bosphorus. The oath-taking ceremony likely took place 2 days later, on Easter Sunday. Godfrey, Baldwin, and their principal lords swore to recognize the emperor as overlord of any territories they might conquer and pledged to hand over to imperial authorities any former imperial lands they might reclaim. In return, they received generous gifts of money and were entertained at a banquet hosted by the emperor. As soon as these formalities concluded, Godfrey and his men were ferried across to Chalcedon and marched onward to establish camp at Pelicanum, along the road to Nicomedia. Alexius had little time to waste. A mixed force, probably composed of vassals of Godfrey who had opted to travel via Italy, had already reached the outskirts of Constantinople and were waiting on the shores of the Sea of Marmara near Sosthenium. Like Godfrey's men, They displayed a defiant attitude and hoped to delay their progress until Bohemond and his Norman troops arrived, who they knew were close behind. But the emperor was determined to prevent them from uniting with Godfrey's forces. It took some skirmishing to maintain control over their movements, and once Godfrey had safely crossed the Bosphorus, Alexius transported these men by sea to the capital, where they joined other small groups of crusaders who had trickled across the Balkans. It required all of Alexius's diplomatic skill and generous bribes to convince their leaders to swear allegiance. Once they finally consented, Alexius elevated the ceremony's prestige by bringing Godfrey and Baldwin over to witness it. The Western lords were sullen and unruly. One of them even sat on the emperor's throne, prompting a sharp rebuke from Baldwin, who reminded him that he had just become the emperor's vassal and should respect local customs. The Western knight retorted that it was rude of the emperor to remain seated while so many great warriors stood before him. When this comment was translated for Alexius, he requested to speak directly with the knight. Upon hearing the knight boast of his skill in single combat, Alexius mildly advised him to consider employing different tactics when facing the Turks. This exchange reflected the underlying tension between the emperor and the Franks. The rough knights from the west were naturally awed by the palace's opulence, the elaborate ceremonial, and the court's polished manners. Once the oaths had been sworn, these knights and their men were transported across the straits to join Godfrey's army on the Asian shore. The emperor's timing proved fortunate, for on April 9th, Bohemond of Taranto arrived at Constantinople. Initially, the Normans of southern Italy had shown little enthusiasm for Urban's call to crusade. Ever since Robert Guiscard's death, civil strife had plagued the region. Robert had divorced his first wife and left the Duchy of Apulia to his son by his second wife, Sigilgaita, Roger Borsa. Bohemond rebelled against his brother, managing to seize control of Taranto and the Terra di Otranto in the heel of Italy. Eventually, their uncle Roger of Sicily brokered an uneasy truce between them, but Bohemond never fully accepted the arrangement and continued to undermine Roger Borsa whenever he could. By the summer of 1096, the entire family had assembled to punish the rebellious city of Amalfi. Although papal decrees concerning the crusade had already been announced and small groups of southern Italians had crossed to the east, it wasn't until the arrival of large French crusading forces in Italy that Bohemond grasped the movement's true potential. Realizing that the crusade offered him a chance to carve out a principality in the Levant, Bohemond saw his opportunity. The zeal of the French crusaders also stirred the Norman soldiers encamped before Amalfi, and Bohemond seized the moment to harness their enthusiasm. He declared that he too would take the cross and called upon all faithful Christians to join him. Before his gathered army, he tore his rich scarlet cloak into strips to create crosses for his captains. His vassals eagerly followed his lead, as did many of his brothers and uncles' vassals, leaving Roger of Sicily lamenting that the crusade had stripped him of his army. Bohemond's nephew William departed immediately with the French crusaders. However, Bohemond himself required some time to organize his forces. He entrusted the management of his lands to his brother and secured sufficient funds to cover the expenses of everyone accompanying him. The expedition set sail from Bari in October. Alongside Bohemond were his nephew Tancred, his cousins Richard and Rainulf of Salerno, along with Rainulf's son Richard, Geoffrey, Count of Rossignolo, and his brothers, Robert of Ansa, Herman of Canny, Humphrey of Monte Scabioso, Albert of Cagnano, and Bishop Gerard of Ariano, representing the Normans from Sicily. Normans from France who joined Bohemond included Robert of Sourdevil and Bull of Chartres. Though Bohemond's army was smaller than Godfrey's, it was well-equipped and highly trained. The expedition landed at multiple locations along the coast of Epirus between Dorylaeum and Avlona, eventually regrouping at a village named Dropoli, situated in the valley of the River Vusa. The landing arrangements had likely been coordinated with the Byzantine authorities at Dorylaeum, who may have preferred to avoid further taxing the resources of the towns along the Via Egnatia. However, the choice of route for the army's advance was probably Bohemond's decision. His earlier campaigns 15 years prior had familiarized him with the region south of the main road, and by choosing a less common path, he may have hoped to evade close Byzantine supervision. John Comnenus had no available troops to accompany them, so Bohemond commenced his march without an imperial police escort. Nevertheless, there appeared to be no hostility. Ample supplies were provided for the Normans, and Bohemond sternly instructed his men to respect the Christian land they were passing through and to refrain from looting or causing disorder. Crossing the Pindus Mountains, the army reached Castoria in western Macedonia shortly before Christmas. The exact route remains uncertain, but it must have been arduous, taking them across terrain rising over 4,000 feet above sea level. Upon arrival at Castoria, Bohemond sought to obtain provisions, but the locals, recalling the Normans' past as ruthless invaders, were reluctant to spare anything from their limited supplies. As a result, the army seized the livestock they needed, including cattle, horses, and donkeys, since many of their pack animals had perished during the mountain crossings. They spent Christmas in Castoria before continuing east toward the river Vardar. Along the way, they paused to attack a village inhabited by Paulician heretics near their path, burning the houses along with their occupants. Eventually, they reached the Vardar River by mid-February, having taken around 7 weeks to cover just over 100 miles. Bohemond's path likely led him through Edessa, modern Vodina, where he joined the Via Egnatia. From that point onward, he was accompanied by a detachment of Pecheneg soldiers assigned by the emperor, with strict instructions to prevent looting, maintain order, and ensure that the Crusaders never stayed longer than 3 days in any one location. The main body of the army crossed the Vardar River without incident, but the Count of Rossignolo and his brothers lagged behind with a small contingent on the western bank. The Pechenegs, in an effort to push them forward, launched an attack. Upon learning of the skirmish, Tancred immediately turned back across the river to assist. He repelled the Pechenegs and took several prisoners, whom he brought to Bohemond. After questioning them and discovering that they were simply following imperial orders, Bohemond released them without hesitation. His aim was to maintain a correct and respectful relationship with the emperor. Eager to maintain good relations, Bohemond had likely dispatched envoys to the emperor as soon as he landed in Epirus. By the time his army had passed Thessalonica and was approaching Sarres, these ambassadors returned from Constantinople, accompanied by a senior imperial official who soon established a friendly rapport with Bohemond. Ample provisions were arranged for the troops, and in return, Bohemond pledged not to enter any towns along the route and promised to return any livestock his men had seized during their journey. Though some of his followers were eager to plunder the countryside, Bohemond strictly forbade such actions. By April 1st, the army had reached Russa, present-day Keshin, in Thrace. Bohemond decided to move ahead to Constantinople himself to learn what negotiations were taking place between the emperor and the other Western leaders who had already arrived. He left the army under Tancred's command, who led them to a fertile valley off the main road, where they remained over the Easter weekend. Bohemond arrived in Constantinople on April 9th and was housed outside the city walls at the monastery of Saints Cosmas and Damian. The following day, he was granted an audience with the emperor. To Emperor Alexius, Bohemond appeared to be the most threatening of all the crusading leaders. The Byzantines' past encounters with the Normans had proven them to be powerful foes, and Bohemond had already shown himself to be a capable and commanding leader. His troops were well prepared, disciplined, and deeply loyal. Although at times overly confident in strategy and not always prudent, he was an astute diplomat and a visionary political figure. Bohemond's appearance made a strong impression. Anna Comnena, who both knew him and deeply disliked him, could not help but acknowledge his charisma and spoke admiringly of his looks. He stood exceptionally tall, and although in his 40s, he retained the build and complexion of a much younger man. His blonde hair was cropped shorter than the Western fashion, and he was clean-shaven. A slight stoop, dating from his youth, did not diminish his aura of vitality and vigor. Anna noted a certain hardness in his features and a sinister edge to his smile, but Like many Greeks throughout history, she was not immune to physical beauty and ultimately expressed reluctant admiration. Alexius first arranged to meet privately with Bohemond to gauge his intentions. Finding him courteous and cooperative, he later invited Godfrey and Baldwin, who were still lodging in the palace, to join the discussions. Bohemond's courteous behavior was entirely calculated. More than any of the other Crusaders, he fully understood Byzantium's enduring strength and recognized that nothing substantial could be accomplished without its support. A conflict with the empire would spell ruin, but a careful partnership could serve his own ambitions. Bohemond sought leadership of the crusade, though he lacked any official mandate from the Pope and faced competition from the other prominent Crusader lords. If he could secure an official appointment from the emperor, he would gain a powerful position from which to coordinate operations. This role would allow him to mediate between the Crusaders and the emperor, receive the lands recaptured on behalf of the empire, and essentially become the central figure of the entire Christian alliance. Without hesitation, he swore allegiance to the emperor and then proposed that he be granted the title of Grand Domestic of the East. This request placed Alexius in a difficult position. He feared and distrusted Bohemond, but also wished to maintain his favor. Having already shown him considerable generosity and honors, he continued to shower him with money, but avoided committing to the appointment. The emperor explained that the time was not yet right for such a decision, but hinted that Bohemond might earn the title through demonstrated energy and loyalty. Bohemond accepted this vague assurance, which encouraged him to continue his policy of cooperation. In the meantime, Alexius promised to dispatch imperial troops to accompany the Crusader armies, reimburse their expenses, and guarantee their supply lines and communication routes. Bohemond's army was then summoned to Constantinople and, on April 26th, was ferried across the Bosphorus to join Godfrey's forces at Pelicanum. Tancred, who neither approved nor fully grasped his uncle's strategy, entered the city secretly at night with his cousin Richard of Salerno, deliberately avoiding the oath of allegiance. That very same day, Count Raymond of Toulouse arrived in Constantinople and was welcomed by the emperor. Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, was already an older man, likely approaching 60. His hereditary county was among the wealthiest in France, and he had recently inherited the prosperous Marquisate of Provence. Through his marriage to Princess Elvira of Aragon, he was also connected to the royal families of Spain and had participated in numerous military campaigns against the Spanish Moors. He was the only major noble to whom Pope Urban had personally outlined the Crusades' objectives, and he was the first to publicly commit to the cause. For this reason, he considered himself, with some justification, entitled to lead the expedition as its lay commander. However, the Pope, eager to preserve ecclesiastical authority over the movement, had never granted him such recognition. Nevertheless, Raymond likely anticipated that the need for a secular leader would eventually become evident. In the meantime, he set out for the east accompanied by its designated spiritual leader, the Bishop of Le Puy. Raymond had taken the cross during the assembly at Clermont in November 1095, but he did not depart from his lands until the following October. He vowed to spend the remainder of his life in the Holy Land. Yet this vow may have been somewhat conditional, as he left his estates in France under the administration of his illegitimate son, Bertrand, without formally relinquishing his titles. His wife and his legitimate heir, Alfonso, accompanied him on the expedition. To finance the journey, he sold or mortgaged portions of his lands, though it appears he exercised some restraint in outfitting his forces. His character is not easy to define. His behavior often revealed vanity, stubbornness, and a certain greed. However, his courteous demeanor made a favorable impression on the Byzantines, who considered him more refined than many of his peers. They also regarded him as relatively trustworthy and honorable. Anna Comnena, whose later experiences inclined her to view him favorably, praised his noble disposition and virtuous conduct. Adhemer of Le Puy, a man of undoubted integrity, clearly valued his friendship. Several prominent nobles from southern France joined Raymond's expedition. These included Rambald, Count of Orange, Gaston of Barne, Gerard of Roussillon, William of Montpellier, Raymond of Le Forez, and Isord of Gap. Adhemer of Le Puy was accompanied by his brothers, Francis Lambert of Monteil, Lord of Peyrains, and William Hugh of Monteil, along with their followers. After Adhemer, the most senior churchman in the party was William, Bishop of Orange. The army crossed the Alps via the Col de Ginevra and made its way through northern Italy to the head of the Adriatic Sea. Perhaps for reasons of cost, Raymond chose not to travel by sea, but to proceed along the eastern Adriatic coast, through Istria and Dalmatia. This decision proved unwise, as the roads in Dalmatia were in poor condition, and the local inhabitants were hostile and rough. Istria was crossed without incident, but for 40 harsh winter days, the army struggled along the rugged Dalmatian paths, constantly harassed by wild Slav tribes trailing the rear of the column. Raymond himself stayed with the rear guard to protect it, and at one point, he saved his men by erecting a barricade across the road, composed of captured Slav prisoners whom he had brutally mutilated. Though he had begun the journey with ample provisions, the hardships were severe, yet no one in his force died from starvation or combat during the march. By the time they reached Skodra, supplies were nearly exhausted. Raymond secured an audience with the local Serbian prince, Bouillon, who, in exchange for rich gifts, allowed the Crusaders to trade freely in the town's markets. Unfortunately, there was little food available to purchase. The army was forced to continue its journey, increasingly plagued by hunger and suffering, until it finally reached the imperial frontier north of Dorylaeum in early February. At last, Raymond and Adhemer hoped that their ordeal was nearing its end. John Comnenus received the Crusaders at Dorylaeum, where imperial envoys and a Pecheneg escort awaited them to guide their journey along the Via Egnatia. Raymond dispatched a delegation ahead to Constantinople to announce his arrival. After a brief rest at Dorylaeum, the army resumed its march. Adhemer's brother, the Lord of Peyrains, remained behind to recover from an illness brought on by the hardships of the journey. Raymond's men were unruly and poorly disciplined. They deeply resented the constant surveillance by the Pecheneg guards and frequently clashed with them due to their persistent inclination toward plundering. Not long after setting out, 2 Provençal barons were killed in one of these skirmishes. Soon afterward, the Bishop of Le Puy, having wandered from the road, was wounded and captured by the Pechenegs before they realized his identity. He was quickly released and returned to the army, seemingly without holding a grudge, though the soldiers were deeply shaken. Tensions rose further when Raymond himself was attacked in a similar incident near Edessa. Upon reaching Thessalonica, the Bishop of Le Puy left the army to seek proper care for his wounds, remaining there until his brother could join him from Dorylaeum. Without his steadying presence, discipline among the troops deteriorated even more. Despite this, no major disaster occurred until they reached Rusa in Thrace. Bohemond's forces had been warmly welcomed there just 2 weeks earlier, but perhaps due to a lack of remaining provisions, Raymond's men took offense at something. Shouting "Toulouse, Toulouse," they stormed the town, breached the walls, and looted the houses. A few days later at Rodosto, Raymond's envoys returned from Constantinople, accompanied by an imperial representative and cordial messages urging Raymond to hurry to the capital. The message added that Bohemond and Godfrey were eager for his presence. Likely motivated by the fear of being absent during critical negotiations, Raymond accepted the invitation and hurried on to Constantinople, arriving on April 21st. With Raymond gone, there was no one left to maintain order in the army. The troops immediately began pillaging the countryside. However, now they faced more than just a small Pecheneg escort. Byzantine military regiments stationed nearby swiftly moved in to confront the raiders. In the ensuing battle, Raymond's forces were soundly defeated, fleeing and abandoning their weapons and supplies to the Byzantines. News of the defeat reached Raymond just as he was preparing for his audience with the emperor. At Constantinople, Raymond was initially well received. He was housed in a palace outside the city walls and soon summoned to meet the emperor, who suggested he take the oath of allegiance. However, Raymond, already angered by his difficult journey and the recent defeat of his troops, was frustrated and confused by the political atmosphere at court. His ultimate goal was to be recognized as the leader of the entire crusade. His authority stemmed from the Pope and his association with the papal legate, the Bishop of Le Puy, whose absence now left him without essential support and counsel. Without his trusted advisor, Raymond hesitated to commit himself. Swearing allegiance as the others had done would diminish his unique position tied to the papacy and place him on equal footing with the other crusading leaders. More importantly, Raymond recognized that his greatest rival was Bohemond, who appeared to enjoy the emperor's favor and was rumored to be a candidate for a significant imperial command. Taking the oath could potentially place Raymond under Bohemond's authority as the emperor's representative. Raymond declared that he had come east to serve God, recognizing only divine authority over himself, thus implying his role as the Pope's late delegate. However, he added that if the emperor personally led the Christian forces, he would willingly serve under him. This concession revealed that it was Bohemond, not Alexius, whom he truly opposed. The emperor replied that he could not leave the empire due to its pressing needs. The other Western leaders, concerned that Raymond's stance might jeopardize the entire crusade, pleaded with him to reconsider. Bohemond, eager to secure imperial favor and hopeful for command, even offered to side with the emperor if Raymond caused a dispute, while Godfrey emphasized the harm Raymond's refusal was causing to the Christian cause. Alexius, meanwhile, remained aloof from the negotiations but withheld from Raymond the generous gifts he had bestowed on the other princes. Finally, on April 26th, Raymond agreed to swear a modified oath, promising to respect the emperor's life and honor and to ensure that neither he nor his followers would cause him harm. This form of oath, common among vassals in southern France, satisfied Alexius. Following the conclusion of these negotiations, Bohemond and his army crossed over into Asia. Meanwhile, Raymond's forces, somewhat chastened after their recent troubles, had regrouped at Rodosto, where they awaited the arrival of the Bishop of Le Puy to lead them on to Constantinople. Details of Edhemer's activities in the capital are sparse. It is assumed that he met with the leading Greek clergy and certainly had an audience with the emperor. These meetings were amicable. Edhemer may have played a role in easing tensions between Raymond and Alexius, as their relations quickly improved. However, Bohemond's departure likely contributed more to this reconciliation. The emperor was able to meet privately with Raymond and confide that he too had little affection for the Normans and that Bohemond would never be granted imperial command. 2 days after swearing his oath, Raymond led his army across the Bosphorus, but soon returned to spend 2 weeks at court. By the time he departed, his relations with Alexius had become warm. He now recognized the emperor as a powerful ally against Bohemond. His entire stance toward the empire had shifted. The fourth major Western army to embark on the crusade set out from northern France in October 1096, shortly after Raymond's departure from his own lands. This contingent was jointly commanded by Robert, Duke of Normandy, his brother-in-law, Stephen, Count of Blois, and his cousin, Robert II, Count of Flanders. Robert of Normandy was the eldest son of William the Conqueror. Though mild-tempered and somewhat lacking in decisiveness, he possessed personal bravery and a certain charm. Since his father's death, he had engaged in sporadic conflict with his brother, William Rufus of England, who had repeatedly invaded his duchy. The preaching of Urban II had deeply moved Robert, and he quickly pledged himself to the crusade. In return, the Pope, while still in northern France, brokered a reconciliation between Robert and William. Despite his commitment, Robert delayed for several months in organizing his expedition and ultimately secured the funds he needed by pledging his duchy to William in exchange for 10,000 silver marks. The agreement was finalized in September 1096, and shortly thereafter Robert departed with his army for Pontarlier, where he was joined by Stephen of Blois and Robert of Flanders. Accompanying him were Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, Walter, Count of St. Valery, the heirs of the Counts of Montgomery and Mortagne, Gerard of Gournay, Hugh of St. Pol, the sons of Hugh of Grant-Mesnil, and a host of knights and soldiers from Normandy, England, Scotland, and Brittany. The only English nobleman to participate was Ralph Gauder, Earl of Norfolk, who was living in exile on his mother's estates in Brittany. Stephen of Blois himself had little desire to join the crusade. However, his wife, Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, was the dominant voice in their household, and she insisted that he go. Obedient to her wishes, he set out, accompanied by his principal vassals, Everard of Luputes, Garin-Garinat, Caro Assini, Geoffrey Garin, and his chaplain Alexander. Among them was Fulcher of Chartres, who would later become one of the Crusades' principal historians. Stephen, being one of the wealthiest men in France, was able to fund his journey without difficulty, leaving his lands in his wife's capable hands. The Count of Flanders, though slightly younger, possessed a stronger and more commanding presence. His father, Robert I, had made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1086 and, on his return journey, had briefly served under Emperor Alexius. The two remained in correspondence until Robert's death in 1093. Given this connection, it was natural that Robert II would want to continue his father's efforts against the infidels. His army, while smaller than those led by Raymond or Godfrey, was composed of well-trained and disciplined troops. He was joined by soldiers from Brabant, led by Baldwin of Alost, Count of Ghent. During his absence, the administration of his lands was entrusted to his wife, Clementia of Burgundy. From Pontarlier, the combined army moved southward, crossing the Alps into Italy. In November, while passing through Lucca, they encountered Pope Urban, who was staying there briefly en route from Cremona to Rome. The Pope received the leaders in audience and gave them his personal blessing. The army then proceeded to Rome to visit the tomb of St. Peter, though they chose not to involve themselves in the ongoing conflict between Urban's supporters and those of the anti-Pope Guibert. After leaving Rome, the army traveled via Monte Cassino into the Norman-controlled duchy in southern Italy. There they were warmly welcomed by Roger Borsa, Duke of Apulia. Roger, whose wife Adela was the sister of the Count of Flanders, also acknowledged Robert of Normandy as the senior member of their noble house. Though Roger offered many lavish gifts, Robert of Flanders declined most, accepting only sacred relics, strands of the Virgin Mary's hair and bones of St. Matthew and St. Nicholas, which he later sent to his wife to be enshrined at the Abbey of Watten. While Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois opted to spend the winter in relative comfort in Calabria, Robert of Flanders continued on without delay. He and his men reached Bari and crossed to Epirus in early December. His journey to Constantinople was uneventful, and he arrived around the same time as Bohemond. However, the Count of Alost, attempting to disembark at Camara, was intercepted by a Byzantine naval force. A brief skirmish at sea ensued, vividly described by Anna Comnena, who held the Byzantine commander Marianus Mavrocordakalon, son of the admiral, in high regard. Despite the fierce resistance of a Latin priest, the Flemish vessel was boarded and taken. The Count and his men were then brought ashore at Dorylaeum. Unlike some of the other Western leaders, the Flemish contingent readily accepted the oath of allegiance to Emperor Alexius. Count Robert was, in fact, one of the princes who encouraged Raymond to do the same. Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois remained in southern Italy throughout the winter, delaying their departure until spring. Their lack of eagerness to proceed seemed to affect their troops as well, with many of their men gradually drifting back toward their homes. Eventually, in March, the army moved on to Brindisi, and preparations for embarkation were made on April 5th. Tragedy struck, however, when the first ship to set sail capsized and sank, resulting in the loss of around 400 passengers, along with their horses, mules, and many chests of money. The discovery that the bodies washed ashore bore cross-shaped marks on their shoulder blades was presented as a miraculous sign to comfort the faithful, though it failed to fully reassure some of the more fearful, who abandoned the journey altogether. Nonetheless, the majority of the army successfully embarked and, after 4 rough days at sea, landed at Dorylaeum. The Byzantines welcomed them warmly, providing an escort to guide them along the Via Egnatia towards Constantinople. Apart from one incident, the march was uneventful and pleasant. After pausing for 4 days outside the walls of Thessalonica, the army reached Constantinople in early May. A camp was set up for them just beyond the city walls, and small groups of 5 or 6 were allowed daily into the city to admire its sights and visit its holy places. By this time, the previous crusading contingents had already crossed the Bosphorus, leaving these late arrivals free from the tensions that had troubled earlier interactions with the Byzantines. They were deeply impressed by the city's beauty and grandeur, as well as by the comfort it offered. The emperor's generosity further endeared him to them, as he distributed coins, silk garments, food, and horses to the Crusaders. Their leaders readily swore allegiance to the emperor and were rewarded with splendid gifts. Stephen of Blois, writing to his wife the following month, expressed his amazement at the emperor's hospitality. He stayed 10 days at the palace, where the emperor treated him like a son, offering wise counsel, lavish gifts, and even proposing to educate Stephen's youngest son. Stephen was especially struck by the emperor's generosity towards the entire crusading army and by the effective and abundant provision of supplies for those already in the field. "Your father, my love," he wrote, referring to William the Conqueror, "gave many grand gifts, but he was almost nothing compared to this man." The army remained in Constantinople for 2 weeks before being transported across to Asia. Even the Bosphorus crossing delighted Stephen, who had been warned of its dangers but found it no more perilous than crossing the Marne or the Seine. They then marched along the Gulf of Nicomedia, passing through the city of Nicomedia itself, to join the main crusading forces already engaged in the siege of Nicaea. Alexius could finally breathe more easily. He had sought mercenaries from the west, but instead had received large armies, each commanded by its own leaders. No government welcomes an influx of independent allied forces into its territory, especially when they come from a less advanced civilization. Food had to be supplied, and looting had to be controlled. The exact size of the crusading armies remains uncertain, as medieval figures are often exaggerated. Peter the Hermit's unruly band, including numerous non-combatants, likely numbered close to 20,000. The principal Crusader armies each exceeded 10,000, including civilians. Bohemond's force was slightly smaller, and there were additional minor groups. Altogether, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people likely entered the empire from the west between the summer of 1096 and the spring of 1097. Overall, the emperor's preparations for managing them proved successful. None of the Crusaders faced hunger while crossing the Balkans. The only incidents of raiding for provisions occurred under special circumstances. Walter Sanzawar's plundering at Belgrade, Peter's at Bela Palanka, and Bohemond's at Castoria, while traveling in midwinter along an ill-suited route. Smaller acts of looting and occasional assaults on towns could not be fully prevented, as Alexius lacked sufficient troops to maintain perfect order. Yet his Pecheneg detachments, though often exasperating to the Crusaders with their rigid and uncompromising discipline, served effectively as a police force. His personal envoys generally handled the Western leaders with considerable tact. The growing success of these measures was evident in the smooth progress of the last crusading contingent. At Constantinople, Alexius secured an oath of allegiance from all the leaders except Raymond, with whom he reached a separate understanding. He harbored no illusions about the practical strength of these oaths or the dependability of those who swore them. Nevertheless, the oath granted him a legal advantage that might prove crucial in the future. Securing these commitments had not been easy. While wiser leaders like Bohemond and keen observers like Fulcher of Chartres recognized the necessity of cooperating with Byzantium, the lesser knights and common soldiers viewed the oath as a humiliation and even a betrayal. They had arrived with deep suspicions of the Byzantines, especially after receiving a frosty reception from local peasants. Constantinople itself, with its enormous wealth, bustling markets, elegant nobility in civilian robes, and richly adorned women attended by eunuchs and slaves, filled them with a mixture of contempt and an unsettling sense of inferiority. They could not understand the language or customs, and even the church services felt alien to them. The Byzantines shared this dislike. To the citizens of the capital, these rough and unruly warriors, camped for weeks outside the city walls, were nothing but a burden. The attitude of the countryside is reflected in a letter written by Theophylact, Archbishop of Bulgaria, from his diocese in Achrida along the Via Egnatia. Though known for his relative sympathy toward the West, Theophylact lamented the troubles caused by the Crusaders' passage through his lands, though he added that he and his people were learning to bear the burden with patience. The early stages of the Crusade offered little hope for improved relations between East and West. Despite all this, Alexius was likely not displeased. The immediate threat to Constantinople had passed, and the crusading army was now on its way to confront the Turks. He genuinely intended to collaborate with the Crusaders, but with one clear condition: the interests of the empire would always come first. His foremost duty was to his own people. Like all Byzantines, he believed that the survival of Christendom depended on the preservation of the ancient Christian empire. In this, he was correct. Despite the disagreements between the emperor and the Crusader princes over their ultimate claims and how future conquests should be divided, there was no dispute regarding the initial phase of the campaign against the Muslims. If the Crusaders were to reach Jerusalem, the path through Asia Minor had to be secured to expel the Turks from the region. On strategic matters, there was full consensus, and for the time being, with Byzantine forces fighting alongside them, the Crusaders were content to rely on the seasoned tactical expertise of the empire's commanders. Their first target was the Seljuk capital, Nicaea. Positioned on the edge of Lake Ascania and not far from the Sea of Marmara, Nicaea sat directly on the old Byzantine military route, though an alternate road lay slightly farther east. Leaving such a formidable stronghold in enemy hands would jeopardize all movement and communication across Asia Minor. Emperor Alexius was eager to push the Crusaders forward quickly, as summer was fast approaching and the Crusaders themselves were growing restless. In the final days of April, before the arrival of the northern French forces in Constantinople, orders were issued to break camp at Pelicanum and advance toward Nicaea. The timing proved ideal. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I, was then occupied on his eastern frontier, engaged in a power struggle with the Danishmend princes for control over Melitene. The local Armenian leader, Gabriel, was actively stirring conflict among the neighboring rulers. Kilij Arslan did not view this new Western force as a serious threat. His earlier victory over the undisciplined followers of Peter the Hermit had led him to underestimate the Crusaders. Moreover, reports from his informants in Constantinople may have exaggerated the tensions between the emperor and the Western leaders. Confident that the crusade posed no real danger to Nicaea, he left his family and his wealth within the city walls. It was only upon learning that the Crusader forces were assembling at Pelicanum that he dispatched part of his army westward, following them himself as soon as he could resolve matters in the east. However, his forces arrived too late to prevent the Crusaders from moving on Nicaea. Godfrey of Lorraine's forces departed from Pelicanum around April 26th and advanced toward Nicomedia. There, they paused for 3 days, during which they were joined by Bohemond's contingent, led by Tancred, along with Peter the Hermit and the remnants of his disorganized followers. Bohemond remained in Constantinople a few days longer to coordinate supply arrangements with the emperor. A small unit of Byzantine engineers, accompanied by siege equipment and led by Manuel Buttamites, joined the advancing Crusader army. From Nicomedia, Godfrey led his troops to Civitate, then veered south through the narrow mountain pass where Peter's followers had previously been slaughtered. Their bones still littered the entrance of the gorge. Heeding the emperor's warnings and the grim sight before him, Godfrey proceeded carefully. Scouts and engineers were sent ahead to clear and widen the path, which was then marked with wooden crosses to guide future pilgrims. On May 6th, his forces reached the outskirts of Nicaea. Nicaea, fortified since the 4th century, was surrounded by 4 miles of walls strengthened by 240 towers, kept in good condition by the Byzantines. The city stood at the eastern edge of Lake Ascania, with its western walls rising directly from the shallow waters, forming an irregular pentagon in shape. Godfrey set up camp outside the northern wall, while Tancred positioned his forces to the east. The southern section was reserved for Raymond's army. Although the Turkish garrison inside the city was considerable, it was in urgent need of reinforcements. Messengers were dispatched to the Sultan, urging him to send troops quickly through the southern gates before the siege was fully in place. One of these messengers was intercepted by the Crusaders. However, the Turkish main army was still too distant. Before it could arrive, Raymond reached the city on May 16th and positioned his forces along the southern wall. Bohemond had rejoined his troops a few days earlier. Until then, the Crusaders had struggled with inadequate supplies, but thanks to the logistical arrangements made with Alexius, provisions soon began arriving steadily by both land and sea. By June 3rd, with the arrival of Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois, the entire crusading force was assembled. Although there was no overall commander, the army operated in unison, with strategic decisions made collectively by the leading princes. At this stage, there was still no significant conflict among them. Meanwhile, the emperor relocated to Pelicanum to remain in close contact with both Nicaea and Constantinople. The first Turkish relief detachment reached the city shortly after Raymond's arrival, only to find it entirely encircled by land. After a short and unsuccessful clash with Raymond's forces, it withdrew to wait for the main army, led by the Sultan himself. Following the emperor's orders, Buihamites attempted to open negotiations with the defenders inside Nicaea. As the garrison realized that their relief had retreated, their leaders extended an invitation to Buihamites to enter the city under a safe conduct and discuss surrender terms. He agreed, but shortly afterward, news came that the Sultan's army was approaching, prompting the defenders to break off the talks. Around May 21st, the Sultan and his army arrived from the south and immediately launched an offensive against the Crusaders, attempting to break into the city. Raymond, supported on his right flank by the Bishop of Le Puy, bore the main force of the assault, as neither Godfrey nor Bohemond could afford to leave their own sections of the wall unguarded. However, Robert of Flanders came to Raymond's support with his troops. The fighting continued with great intensity throughout the day, but the Turks failed to make any significant progress. As night fell, the Sultan chose to retreat. He had underestimated the strength of the Crusader forces, and his men were no match for the heavily armed Western Knights in the open terrain outside the city walls. Strategically, it made more sense to fall back into the mountains and abandon Nicaea to its fate. Despite their success, the Crusaders had suffered considerable casualties. Many were killed, including Baldwin, Count of Ghent, and nearly all who fought were injured. Yet, their spirits were high after the victory. Among the fallen Turks, they discovered ropes intended for binding captured Crusaders. To further demoralize the defenders inside the city, the Crusaders decapitated many of the enemy dead and hurled the heads over the walls or mounted them on spikes near the gates. Now free from the threat of outside attack, the Crusaders focused fully on the siege. But the city's defenses were formidable. Raymond and Adhemer attempted to undermine one of the southern towers by sending sappers to tunnel beneath it and set a fire. However, the minor damage caused was quickly repaired by the defenders overnight. In addition, the besiegers discovered that their blockade was not fully effective. Faced with this challenge, the Crusaders appealed to the emperor for help, requesting boats to cut off the lake-based supply route. Alexius was likely already aware of the situation, but may have allowed the Crusaders to come to this realization themselves to emphasize their dependence on his support. Responding to their plea, he sent a small fleet under the command of Buihamites to patrol the lake. When the Sultan withdrew, he had instructed the garrison to act according to its own judgment, as no further aid could be expected. Once the defenders saw Byzantine ships on the lake and realized that the emperor was fully backing the crusade, they began to consider surrender. This outcome was precisely what Alexius had hoped for. He had no interest in claiming a ruined city or subjecting its mostly Christian population to the horrors of sack. The Turkish presence within Nicaea was limited to the military and a small noble class. Negotiations resumed with Bouillonites, and terms of surrender were discussed. However, the garrison hesitated, perhaps still holding out hope for the Sultan's return. Only when they learned that the Crusaders were preparing for a full-scale assault did they finally decide to yield. The assault was scheduled for June 19th. However, as dawn broke, the Crusaders were surprised to see the emperor's banner flying atop the towers of Nicaea. During the night, the Turks had surrendered, and imperial forces had entered the city through the lakeside gates. It's unlikely that the Crusader leaders had been completely unaware of the negotiations. Still, they did not object, recognizing that launching an attack on a city they would not ultimately control would be a waste of both time and lives. Yet they were intentionally excluded from the final arrangements, and this secrecy fueled resentment among the rank and file, who felt they had been robbed of their rightful spoils. Many Crusaders had anticipated looting the city's wealth, but instead, they were only permitted to enter in small groups under strict supervision by the emperor's guards. They had hoped to capture and ransom Turkish nobles, only to watch them being escorted to Constantinople or to the emperor's camp at Pelicanum. This deepened their hostility toward Alexius. However, some of this bitterness was softened by the emperor's acts of generosity. Alexius ordered that every Crusader soldier receive a gift of food, and he summoned the Crusader leaders to Pelicanum, where they were presented with gold and jewels taken from the Sultan's treasury. Stephen of Blois, who traveled there with Raymond of Toulouse, was overwhelmed by the wealth he received and stood in awe of the golden treasures allotted to him. Unlike some of his fellow knights, Stephen did not believe the emperor should have come to Nicaea in person. He understood that the public ceremony marking the city's return to imperial rule might have been awkward for Alexius to attend directly. In exchange for these generous gifts, Alexius requested that the knights who had not yet sworn allegiance to him do so now. Many of the lesser nobles, whom the emperor had previously ignored when they passed through Constantinople, agreed to take the oath. Raymond, apparently, was not asked to make any further commitments. Tancred's case, however, was treated more seriously. Initially defiant, Tancred declared that unless he received the emperor's grand tent filled with gold, along with a sum equal to what had been given to all the other princes, he would refuse to swear loyalty. When George Palaeologus, the emperor's brother-in-law, objected to his insolence, Tancred reacted violently and physically assaulted him. The emperor stood to intervene, and Bohemond sharply scolded his nephew. Eventually, Tancred gave in and reluctantly pledged homage. The Crusaders were also taken aback by the emperor's treatment of the captured Turks. High-ranking officers and court figures were permitted to buy their freedom. The Sultan's wife, who was the daughter of Emir Shaka, was received in Constantinople with royal honors. She was to remain there until her husband sent word regarding where she should join him. She and her children would then be sent to him without any demand for ransom. Alexius, known for his compassion, understood the power of showing respect to a defeated foe. But to the Western lords, his actions appeared insincere and even disloyal. Although some Crusaders were disappointed that they had neither captured Nicaea themselves nor claimed its treasures, the city's liberation brought a renewed sense of joy and optimism. News was sent west proclaiming that this ancient city had once again returned to Christian hands, and the announcement was met with enthusiasm. The success at Nicaea affirmed the legitimacy of the crusade. Inspired by the victory, new volunteers came forward to join the cause, and the Italian cities began to show greater seriousness and support for the campaign. Within the Crusader camp, morale was high, and the knights were eager to press on toward their ultimate goal. Stephen of Blois expressed his confidence in a letter to his wife, writing, "In 5 weeks, we will be in Jerusalem, unless," he added with unintentional foresight, "we are delayed at Antioch." From Nicaea, the Crusaders proceeded along the old Byzantine military highway that crossed Asia Minor. This main road connected the route from Chalcedon and Nicomedia with the road coming from Helenopolis and Nicaea, converging at the banks of the Sangarius River. From there, the road veered south, following a tributary valley past modern-day Balsic and continued over a mountain pass toward Dorylaeum, near present-day Eskişehir. At Dorylaeum, the route divided into three main paths. The primary Byzantine military road stretched eastward, likely bypassing Ankara to the south. After crossing the Halys River, it split again. One branch led directly through Sebastia, modern Shivas, into Armenia, while the other turned toward Caesarea Mazaka. From there, several roads crossed the Antioch mountain range into the Euphrates Valley. Another route turned southwest, passing through Tyana and eventually reaching the Cilician Gates. A second road from Dorylaeum cut across the vast central salt desert of Asia Minor, running just south of Lake Tata from Amorium to the Cilician Gates. Due to the barren terrain and lack of water, this route was only suitable for small, fast-moving units. The third road followed the southern edge of the salt desert, extending from Philomelium, modern Alexius, to Iconium and Heraclea, then on to the Cilician Gates. From near Philomelium, one branch led to the Mediterranean port of Italia, while another, just beyond Iconium, led to Seleucia on the coast. Regardless of which path the Crusaders would ultimately follow, their first destination had to be Dorylaeum. On June 26th, 1 week after Nicaea's fall, the vanguard set out. Over the next 2 days, the remaining divisions followed, regrouping at the bridge over the Blue River, where the road departed from the Sangarius Valley and ascended to the Anatolian Plateau. The Crusaders were accompanied by a small Byzantine contingent under the seasoned General Tatius. Some members of the Crusader force remained behind to serve the emperor. These men were placed under the command of Butamites and tasked with repairing and garrisoning the city. At a village called Lus, near the bridge, the Crusader leaders met to discuss their next steps. To reduce pressure on local resources, they agreed to split the army into 2 groups, traveling a day apart. The first group was composed of the Normans from southern Italy and northern France, along with the forces of the Counts of Flanders and Blois, and the Byzantines, who also served as guides. The second group included the southern French, the men of Lorraine, and the troops under the Count of Vermandois. Bohemond was appointed leader of the first division, while Raymond of Toulouse commanded the second. Once the division was settled, Bohemond's army began its march toward Dorylaeum. After failing to relieve Nicaea, Sultan Kilij Arslan retreated eastward to regroup his forces and forge an alliance with the Danishmend emir to confront the growing threat posed by the Crusaders. The loss of Nicaea had shaken him, especially the forfeiture of his treasury, which was a significant blow. Still, the Turks retained a nomadic mindset. The Sultan's true seat of power was wherever he pitched his tent. In the final days of June, he began moving back westward with his own army, accompanied by his vassal Hassan, emir of the Cappadocian Turks, and the forces of the Danishmend emir. By June 30th, they had taken up position in a valley near Dorylaeum, lying in wait to ambush the Crusaders as they descended from the pass. That evening, the Crusader vanguard set up camp in the plain near Dorylaeum. At sunrise, the Turks launched a sudden assault, pouring down the hillsides with fierce cries. But Bohemond had anticipated the possibility of attack. He swiftly gathered the non-combatant pilgrims into the center of the camp, where natural springs provided water. Women were assigned the task of carrying water to the front lines. Tents were hastily fortified, and the knights were instructed to dismount and fight on foot. A rider was immediately dispatched to alert the Second Army and urge them to hurry to their aid. Meanwhile, Bohemond rallied his captains, warning them to prepare for a hard battle and to maintain a defensive stance at the start. Only one knight disobeyed these orders, the same man who had once arrogantly seated himself on the emperor's throne in Constantinople. Leading 40 of his men, he charged into the enemy lines but was quickly repelled and returned, severely wounded and humiliated. Soon, the camp was encircled by a seemingly endless horde of Turkish warriors. Using their usual tactic, waves of archers ran forward to release volleys of arrows before swiftly retreating to let others take their place. As the heat of the July morning intensified, doubts spread among the Crusaders about whether they could withstand the relentless assault. Surrounded and unable to flee, They knew surrender meant slavery. Many resolved to die as martyrs rather than give in. But around midday, they saw salvation approaching. The Second Army had arrived. Godfrey and Hugh led the front, followed closely by Raymond and his troops. The Turks, unaware that the Crusader forces had been divided, had believed they were facing the full army and were taken by surprise. They hesitated, unable to stop the two groups from linking up. The Crusaders, now united and reinvigorated, formed a broad battle line. Bohemond, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois took the left. Raymond and Robert of Flanders held the center, and Godfrey and Hugh commanded the right. Inspired by the promise of victory and the riches it could bring, they launched a counterattack. The Turks, caught off guard and likely running low on ammunition, began to falter. Panic spread when a new threat appeared behind them. The Bishop of Le Puy and a detachment of southern French troops had descended from the hills. Adhemer had planned this flanking maneuver in advance, navigating through the mountain trails with the help of local guides. His timely intervention sealed the Crusader victory. The Turkish lines collapsed, and their army fled eastward in disarray. In their rush to escape, they abandoned their entire camp. The Sultan's tent, along with those of his emirs and all their treasure, fell into the hands of the Crusaders. The victory was a significant one. Though it came at the cost of many Christian lives, it marked a turning point. The Franks gained a newfound respect for the military strength of the Turks. In fact, perhaps to elevate the importance of their own success, they often expressed admiration for the Turks, even more than for the Byzantines, whose more strategic and methodical approach to warfare they dismissed as overly refined or decadent. The Byzantine contribution to the battle received little acknowledgement from the Crusaders. The anonymous Norman chronicler of the Gesta even remarked that the Turks might be the noblest of peoples. He cited an old tale linking the Franks and the Turks as descendants of the Trojans, a myth born more from shared rivalry with the Greeks than from any real ethnic connection. Yet, however worthy the Turkish soldiers may have been, their defeat opened the way for the Crusaders to move safely through Asia Minor. Having lost both his capital and much of his treasure, the Sultan saw no point in continuing resistance. Encountering a group of Syrian Turks who had arrived too late for the battle, he confessed that he had underestimated the strength and numbers of the Franks and could no longer oppose them effectively. Retreating into the hills, he and his forces looted and abandoned the towns they had once occupied, leaving the countryside ravaged in an attempt to deprive the Crusaders of food as they advanced. After their victory, the Crusaders paused for 2 days at Dorylaeum to recover and to plan their next move. Choosing the route ahead was relatively straightforward. The main military road to the east cut through regions still controlled by the Danishmends and powerful local emirs. The Crusader army, being too large and slow to risk a direct path across the central salt desert, had to take the longer route along the southern edge of the desert, near the mountain foothills. This was almost certainly the advice of Tacitus and his Byzantine guides. Even so, the road ahead was uncertain. Years of Turkoman raids and prolonged warfare had left villages destroyed, fields abandoned, walls polluted or dry, and many bridges in ruins. Reliable information was hard to gather from the sparse and fearful local population. Whenever obstacles arose, the Franks were quick to accuse the Greek guides of betrayal, while the Greeks, frustrated by the undisciplined and ungrateful behavior of the Franks, grew increasingly resentful. Tacitus found his role ever more difficult and unpleasant. On July 3rd, the Crusader army resumed its march, this time remaining together in a single, unified column to avoid the dangers experienced at Dorylaeum. They moved southeastward across the Anatolian plateau, but could not stick to the old imperial road. After passing through Polybotus, they veered toward Pisidian Antioch. From there, they crossed the bare mountain passes of the Sultan Dag and rejoined the main route at Philomelium. Beyond Philomelium, the path led through a bleak and arid region lying between the mountains and the desert. Under the searing midsummer sun, both heavily armored knights and foot soldiers endured great suffering. Water was nowhere to be found except for the briny marshes of the desert, and vegetation was limited to thorny shrubs, whose branches were chewed in desperation to relieve thirst. Along the roadside stood the remains of old Byzantine cisterns. Horses were the first to succumb to the conditions. Many knights were forced to march on foot. Others were seen riding oxen, while sheep, goats, and even dogs were recruited to drag supply wagons. Despite these hardships, the Crusaders' morale remained remarkably strong. To Fulcher of Chartres, the unity and camaraderie among soldiers from so many different lands and languages seemed nothing short of divinely inspired. By mid-August, the Crusaders arrived at Iconium, which had been under Turkish control for 13 years. Though it would soon become Kilij Arslan's new capital, the city was deserted at the time. The Turks had retreated into the mountains, taking with them whatever they could carry. However, they could not take away the flowing streams or the lush orchards in the beautiful Merom Valley behind the city. The valley's rich fertility amazed the exhausted Crusaders, who took the opportunity to rest there for several days and regain their strength. The entire army was in dire need of rest. Even the leaders were suffering. Godfrey had recently been injured while hunting a bear, and Raymond of Toulouse was gravely ill, believed to be near death. The Bishop of Orange administered the last rites. Yet the stop in Iconium proved restorative, and Raymond recovered enough to continue the march with the rest of the army. Heeding the advice of the small Armenian population living nearby, the Crusaders stocked up on water before pressing on toward the fertile valley of Heraclea. At Heraclea, they encountered a Turkish force commanded by Emir Hassan and the Danishman Emir. These leaders, concerned for their holdings in Cappadocia, may have hoped that their presence would persuade the Crusaders to attempt a difficult crossing of the Taurus Mountains toward the coast. But rather than being deterred, the Crusaders immediately launched an assault. Bohemond led the charge and sought out the Danishman Emir directly. The Turks, unwilling to engage in a full-scale battle, quickly withdrew to the north, leaving the towns for the Crusaders to claim. Their victory was marked by a comet streaking through the sky. With the road ahead now open, the leaders met once more to decide their next steps. Just east of Heraclea, the main road crossed the formidable Taurus Mountains through the Cilician Gates. However, the route was fraught with danger. Its steep and constricted terrain made it easy for even a small enemy force to ambush and devastate a slow-moving army. Additionally, Cilicia remained in Turkish hands, and the intense heat in September, well known to the Byzantine guides, posed a serious threat. Worse still, any army passing through Cilicia en route to Antioch would have to tackle another difficult pass over the Amanus Mountains, known as the Syrian Gates. An alternative had now become available thanks to the Turks' recent defeat. The road to Caesarea Mazaca offered another viable route. From Caesarea, the old Byzantine military road extended across the anti-Taurus mountains to Marash, and from there descended through the wide, lower Amanus gates into the plains surrounding Antioch. Before the Turkish invasions, this route had served as the main artery connecting Antioch to Constantinople. It also offered the advantage of passing through territories controlled by Christian Armenian princes, many of whom were nominally loyal to the Byzantine emperor and generally favorable to the Crusader cause. This second route was likely recommended by Titius and the Byzantine advisors, but opposition arose from Crusader leaders hostile to the emperor, led by Tancred. In the end, most of the army chose the road through Caesarea. However, Tancred, with a contingent of southern Italian Normans and Baldwin, Godfrey's brother, accompanied by some Flemish and Lorrainer troops, opted to separate from the main force and make their way into Cilicia. Around September 10th, Tancred and Baldwin each departed by separate routes to cross the Taurus Mountains, while the main Crusader force marched northeast toward Caesarea. Along the way, near the village of Augustopolis, the Crusaders encountered Emir Hassan's forces and dealt them another defeat. However, in an effort to avoid delays, they chose not to besiege a nearby fortress belonging to the emir. Instead, they occupied several small villages, which were granted to a local Armenian noble named Simeon, who agreed to govern them under the authority of the Byzantine emperor. By the end of the month, the Crusaders reached Caesarea, which had already been abandoned by the Turks. They did not remain there, but continued on to Comnenus, a flourishing Armenian town then under siege by Danish-men Turks. At the Crusaders' arrival, the Turkish besiegers quickly retreated. Though the Bohemond set off in pursuit, he was unable to catch them. The citizens of Comnenus welcomed their liberators warmly and agreed to accept a Byzantine-appointed governor. Titius named Peter of Alps, a Provençal knight who had previously served under Guiscard before entering imperial service. The appointment was well received and demonstrated that, at least for the moment, cooperation between the Franks and Byzantines was still functioning in accordance with the agreement made between the princes and the emperor. From Comnenus, the army moved southeast to Koxan, modern-day Yaghi-Siyan, a thriving Armenian town nestled in a fertile valley at the base of the Antioch range. The Crusaders paused there for 3 days, enjoying the hospitality of the local population and gathering ample provisions for the challenging journey ahead across the mountains. During this time, a rumor reached the camp that the Turks had abandoned Antioch. Bohemond was still away, pursuing the Danishman forces, so Raymond of Toulouse, without broad consultation, decided to act on the news. He sent 500 knights led by Peter of Castillon to quickly advance and seize the city. The knights rode swiftly, but upon arriving at a Paulician-held castle near the Orontes River, they learned that the rumor was false. Peter of Castillon appears to have returned to the main army. However, one of his knights, Peter of Roix, took matters into his own hands. With a small band of companions, he launched an independent raid, defeating local Turkish forces and capturing a number of forts and villages in the Ruja Valley near Aleppo, aided by the support of Armenian locals. Although Raymond's intent may have been focused more on achieving glory and seizing spoils than on securing control of Antioch itself, Bohemond, upon his return, viewed the action with distrust. The incident revealed the widening rift between the Crusader leaders. The next leg of the journey, from Koxan onward, proved to be the most grueling part of the entire expedition. It was now early October, and the autumn rains had begun. The route over the Antioch Mountains was in dreadful condition. Horses lost their footing and plunged off the cliffs. Lines of pack animals, tied together, would fall one after another into the ravines. Riders dismounted, as no one dared to remain on horseback. Knights, burdened by their heavy armor, struggled to continue, and many tried to sell their gear or abandon it altogether in despair. The harshness of the mountains claimed more lives than any enemy battle. Relief only came when the army finally emerged into the welcoming valley that surrounded Marash. At Marash, where the Crusaders once again encountered a welcoming Armenian community, they paused for several days. The town was ruled by Thatul, an Armenian prince and former Byzantine official, who was confirmed in his authority. During this time, Bohemond rejoined the army after his unsuccessful chase of the Turks. Baldwin also arrived from Cilicia to see his wife, Godfrey, who was dying. After her passing, he resumed his journey eastward. Around October 15th, the main Crusader army left Marash, rejuvenated and prepared, and descended into the plain of Antioch. By the 20th, they reached the Iron Bridge, located just a few hours from the city. It had been 4 months since the Crusade departed for Nicaea. Considering the immense size of the army, which included many non-combatants, and the challenges of traversing dry, hostile terrain during the heat of summer while facing a swift and dangerous enemy, their progress was extraordinary. Their strength stemmed not only from their faith and determination to reach the Holy Land, but also from hopes of wealth and noble titles. Additionally, the Byzantine guides who accompanied them played a crucial role. Their deep knowledge of Turkish tactics and the region's geography allowed them to provide invaluable direction. Though occasional misjudgments occurred, these were understandable given that many roads had fallen into disrepair or been deliberately damaged over the past 2 decades. Despite the hardships, Titius maintained cordial relations with the Western leaders throughout the journey to Antioch. Although many common soldiers remained suspicious of the Greeks, the expedition as a whole continued to function smoothly. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexius was securing the Crusaders' rear by re-establishing Christian control across Asia Minor. The Crusaders' early victories had pushed the Seljuks and Danishmends into an uneasy alliance, creating the potential for renewed Turkish resistance in central and eastern Anatolia. In response, Alexius focused on reclaiming the western part of the peninsula. With the growing strength of the Byzantine navy, he aimed to secure a reliable supply route along the southern coast. After reinforcing Nicaea and securing strategic fortresses along the road to Dorylaeum, Alexius sent his brother-in-law, Caesar John Ducas, supported by a naval squadron under Admiral Caspax, to recapture Ionia and Phrygia. The principal target was Smyrna, still under the control of Shaka's son, who ruled much of the Ionian coast and nearby islands, including Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. Other coastal towns like Ephesus remained under the control of his vassals. The inland region of Phrygia was held by isolated Seljuk warlords cut off from the Sultan. To impress the Turks and assert legitimacy, John Ducas brought with him the Sultana, who had not yet been sent to her husband. The combined land and naval offensive proved overwhelming for the emir of Smyrna, who surrendered his territories in exchange for safe passage eastward. He escorted his sister to the Sultan's court, after which he disappears from historical record. Ephesus fell soon after with minimal resistance. While Caspax secured the coastal towns and islands, Ducas pushed inland, capturing major Lydian cities such as Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. By the end of autumn in 1097, the entire province was under Byzantine control. John Ducas prepared to continue his advance into Phrygia once winter passed, aiming to re-establish control over the road from Polybotis and Philomelium down to Italia. This route would extend along the southern coast, guarded by naval power and connected to Armenian-held territories in the Taurus Mountains. With this secure line, supplies could flow reliably to Crusader forces fighting in Syria, enabling a sustained and unified Christian campaign. The Armenian migration to the southwest, which began when the Seljuk invasions made life in the Araxes Valley and around Lake Van increasingly unsafe, continued throughout the closing years of the 11th century. By the time the Crusaders reached eastern Asia Minor, a chain of small Armenian principalities extended from beyond the central Euphrates into the heart of the Taurus Mountains. The short-lived state established by the Armenian leader Philoretus had already collapsed before his death in 1090. However, Thuras still held power in Edessa, having recently succeeded in expelling the Turkish garrison from the citadel. His father-in-law, Gabriel, remained in control of Melitene. At Marash, Thatul, the leading Christian figure in the town, was confirmed as governor by the Byzantine authorities after the Crusaders restored the city to them. Further east, at Rabin and Kaisan, an Armenian named Kok Vasil, also known as Vasil the Robber, had carved out his own small domain. Thuras, Gabriel, and likely Thatul as well had all begun their public careers within the Byzantine administration, serving under Philoretus. Though ethnically Armenian, they were aligned with the Orthodox Church rather than the Armenian Church and continued to use imperial titles granted by the emperor long ago. They made efforts to maintain contact with Constantinople and regularly reaffirmed their allegiance to the Byzantine court. Thuras had even received the high-ranking title of Chiropolates from Emperor Alexius. This imperial association lent a degree of legitimacy to their rule, though a more practical form of survival came through their willingness to accept the overlordship of neighboring Turkish warlords. Thuras was particularly skilled at playing rival Turkish leaders against one another to maintain his independence, while Gabriel had gone as far as sending his wife on a diplomatic mission to Baghdad to gain recognition from leading Muslim authorities. Still, the position of these Armenian rulers was precarious. Apart from Kok Vasil, they were religiously distinct from most of their fellow Armenians and faced hostility from the numerous Syrian Christians living in their lands. They were also distrusted by the Turks, who only tolerated their presence due to internal divisions. In the Taurus Mountains, the Armenian communities were better protected. The region was difficult to access and could be easily defended. Ashin, the son of Hethum, controlled the mountains west of the Cilician Gates from his stronghold at Lamprin. Ashen maintained occasional ties with Constantinople and had been granted the Byzantine title of Stratopodarch of Cilicia. Though likely not a member of the Orthodox Church, he had once served under Alexius and had likely taken over Lamprin from its still intact Byzantine garrison with the emperor's tacit approval. From Lamprin, Ashen frequently launched raids into the Cilician plain. In 1097, taking advantage of Turkish distraction caused by the Crusaders' advance, he succeeded in capturing part of the town of Adana. East of the Cilician Gates, another Armenian prince, Constantine, son of Rupin, held sway. His main fortress was Partsepert, northwest of Sis. Since his father's death, Constantine had expanded eastward toward the Antioch Mountains and had seized the fortress of Vaca, situated on the Goksu River, from an isolated Byzantine garrison. A strong supporter of the Armenian Apostolic Church, Constantine inherited his father's deep-seated animosity toward Byzantium, rooted in the legacy of the Bagratid dynasty. Like Ashen, he sought to exploit Turkish weakness to establish a stronger position for himself in the fertile Cilician plain, where Armenians already formed a large part of the population. Baldwin of Bouillon had shown a growing interest in Armenian affairs for some time. At Nicaea, he formed a close bond with an Armenian named Bagrat, a former official in the Byzantine service and brother of Coke Vasil. Bagrat soon joined Baldwin's entourage. It's likely that Bagrat hoped to gain Baldwin's support for the Armenian principalities along the Euphrates, where his family had deep ties. When Tancred announced at Heraclea his intention to leave the main army and try his fortune in Cilicia, Baldwin quickly realized it would be unwise to let another Western noble be the first to establish influence among the Armenians. If he hoped to become their main ally, he would need to act. There is little reason to believe that Baldwin and Tancred had coordinated their plans. Both were younger sons from noble families with limited prospects in Europe, and both were determined to carve out domains for themselves in the East. However, Baldwin had already set his sights on forming an Armenian-based state, while Tancred appeared more flexible. Tancred opposed the detour to Caesarea mainly because it was a Byzantine suggestion, and he had little interest in actions that would benefit the empire. Moreover, the nearby Christian population presented him with a strategic opening. Around September 15th, Tancred departed the Crusader camp at Heraclea with a small force of about 100 knights and 200 infantrymen, heading straight for the Cilician Gates. Shortly thereafter, Baldwin followed with a larger contingent, including his cousin Baldwin of Labourg, Raymond of Toul, and Peter of Stenay. Neither group included non-combatants. Baldwin's wife, Godfrey, and their children remained with the main force. Tancred appears to have taken the most direct route to the pass, traveling along what is now the modern railway line through Yaghi-Siyan. Baldwin, with a heavier and slower army, opted for the older route descending from Tyana to Podandus at the head of the defile. As a result, he was 3 days behind Tancred in reaching the plain. Once through the mountains, Tancred advanced on Tarsus, then the leading city in Cilicia. He also sent word back to the main army requesting reinforcements. Tarsus was defended by a Turkish garrison, which launched an immediate attack to repel Tancred's forces but was driven back with heavy losses. The city's Christian residents then approached Tancred and urged him to take control. However, the Turks held their position until Baldwin's army came into view 3 days later. Faced with overwhelming numbers, the garrison slipped away under cover of night. The next morning, the Christian inhabitants opened the city gates to Tancred, whose banner soon flew over its towers. But Baldwin arrived soon afterward to find the city already claimed. Tancred had not brought any Byzantine officials with him, and clearly had no intention of surrendering his gains to the emperor. Yet Baldwin proved an even more formidable rival. Baldwin demanded that control of Tarsus be handed over to him. Though enraged, Tancred recognized he lacked the strength to resist and was compelled to comply. He withdrew his forces and set off eastward toward Adana. Baldwin had barely secured control of Tarsus when a contingent of 300 Norman soldiers arrived from a main army, sent to reinforce Tancred. Despite their pleas, Baldwin refused them entry into the city. While they camped outside the walls, they were attacked at night by remnants of the Turkish garrison who had been roaming the surrounding countryside. All were slaughtered. The incident sent shockwaves through the Crusader ranks. Even Baldwin's own troops held him responsible, and his position might have been seriously compromised. Word soon arrived that a Christian fleet had unexpectedly appeared in the Bay of Mersin, near the mouth of the Cydnus River, just below Tarsus. The fleet was commanded by Guymer of Bouillon. A seasoned pirate, Guymer had anticipated that the crusade would require naval support. In the spring, he had assembled a force of fellow seafarers and sailed from the Low Countries, hoping to link up with the Crusader forces. Still loyal to his homeland, he was thrilled to discover that an army nearby was commanded by the brother of his own count. He sailed up the river to Tarsus and pledged allegiance to Baldwin, who in turn borrowed 300 of his men to help garrison the city. Baldwin likely appointed Guymer as his lieutenant in Tarsus while he prepared to move eastward. Meanwhile, Tancred had reached Adana and found it in disarray. Ossian of Lamperin had recently raided the town and left a force behind, now locked in conflict with the Turks. Adding to the confusion, a Burgundian knight named Welf had forced his way into the city and now occupied the citadel. Upon Tancred's arrival, the Turks withdrew. Welf welcomed Tancred's troops into the citadel and was confirmed in his control of the city. Ossian, likely interested only in retrieving his men from a dangerous situation, expressed gratitude for Tancred's intervention and urged him to press on to Mistra, where the entirely Armenian population longed to be freed from Turkish domination. Ossian was also keen to see the Franks challenge the influence of his rival, Constantine of the Rapinian line. Tancred arrived at Mistra in early October. As in Adana, the Turks fled at his approach, and the city's Christian population gladly opened its gates to him. Not long after, Baldwin and his army caught up. However, Baldwin had apparently already concluded that Cilicia would not be the site of his future domain. The humid and malarial climate in late summer may have dissuaded him, or perhaps he considered it too close to the expanding reach of the Byzantine Empire. His advisor Bagrat was encouraging him to head east, where Armenians were actively seeking his support. At this point, Baldwin had significantly undermined Tancred's prospects of establishing a powerful state in Cilicia. Now, he was preparing to return to the main Crusader force to consult with his brother and allies before launching a new campaign. But Tancred remained wary. He refused Baldwin entry into Mistra and insisted that his rival camp across the Gihon River. Nevertheless, he allowed provisions from the town to be sent to Baldwin's camp. Still, many Normans were enraged that Baldwin had not been punished for the incident at Tarsus. They convinced Tancred to join them in launching a surprise attack on Baldwin's camp. The effort backfired. Baldwin's forces were too numerous and too well organized, and they quickly repelled the attackers, driving them back across the river in disarray. The disgraceful skirmish sparked a backlash. Realizing the futility of their conflict, Baldwin and Tancred reconciled. But the damage was done. It was now painfully evident that the Crusader princes were unwilling to cooperate for the greater cause of Christendom when personal ambition was at stake. The local Christian populations, watching closely, soon understood that their so-called liberators were driven more by self-interest than altruism. It became clear that the most effective strategy was to exploit the divisions among the Franks. Following his reconciliation with Tancred at Mistra, Baldwin quickly made his way back to the main Crusader force at Marash. Word had reached him that his wife, Godfrey, was near death, and their children too were ill and would not survive much longer. Baldwin stayed only a few days with his brothers and the other leaders of the army. While the main crusading force began its march south toward Antioch, Baldwin turned eastward to pursue his own ambitions in the Euphrates Valley and the surrounding lands. This time, the group accompanying him was much smaller than the one that had followed him into Cilicia. Perhaps the events at Tarsus had tarnished his reputation as a leader, or perhaps his brothers, now focused on the campaign for Antioch, could not afford to spare any more troops. He had only 100 mounted men with him, but his Armenian advisor Bagrat remained at his side, and he welcomed a new chaplain to his retinue. After Baldwin's departure, Tancred did not stay long in Mamistra. Leaving behind a small garrison, he headed south, circling the head of the Gulf of Issus on his way to Alexandretta. During the journey, he dispatched envoys to Geinmer to request his support. Geinmer readily accepted and sailed with his fleet to join Tancred before Alexandretta. Together, they launched a combined assault and captured the town, which Tancred then garrisoned. From there, he crossed the Amanus Mountains through the Syrian gates to rejoin the Crusader army before Antioch. Ultimately, the expedition into Cilicia yielded little benefit for either Baldwin or Tancred. Neither found the region suitable for establishing a permanent principality. The small Frankish garrisons left in the three Cilician towns would be unable to resist any significant military threat. Still, the campaign was not without its merits. By scattering the Turkish garrisons, the Crusaders helped to prevent the region from being used as a base for Turkish attacks on their flank during the siege of Antioch. The capture of Alexandretta also proved strategically useful, providing a port through which supplies could be delivered. However, the greatest beneficiaries of the Cilician campaign were the Armenian princes in the surrounding highlands. With Turkish authority in the region now weakened, they were able to move gradually into the villages and towns of the plains, laying the groundwork for what would become the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. When Baldwin split from the main army at Marash, the Crusaders were just beginning their advance toward Antioch. At first, Baldwin followed a route that ran parallel to the main army's path, but slightly farther east, likely to shield its left flank. This responsibility may have served as his justification for separating from the force once more. In fact, the entire eastern expedition could be defended on strategic grounds, as the territory he intended to enter was the most likely corridor for reinforcements coming from Khorasan to reach the Turks at Antioch. Additionally, the fertile lands there held the potential to supply the crusading army with much-needed provisions. At Aintab, Baldwin abruptly turned eastward. It's uncertain whether he had any concrete strategy beyond a general ambition to establish a principality along the Euphrates. The circumstances favored such a move. He wouldn't need to wrest the territory from Muslim control, as much of it was already held by friendly Armenian forces. Baldwin was already in contact with Armenian leaders. Through his advisor Bagrat, he had likely made connections with Bagrat's brother, Kokh Vasil, who held lands directly east of Marash. Gabriel of Melitene, under constant threat from the Danishman Turks, was probably seeking Western support, while Thuras of Edessa was definitely in communication with the Crusaders. In fact, Baldwin's decision to abandon Cilicia may have been influenced by a message sent by Thuras inviting him to Edessa. For some time, the Armenians had looked to the west for aid. 2 decades earlier, when Pope Gregory VII was considering a military expedition to defend Eastern Christianity, an Armenian bishop had traveled to Rome to win his support. Even those Armenian princes who had accepted Byzantine titles often preferred Western alliances, seeking to free themselves from the yoke of an empire they deeply resented. The arrival of a victorious Frankish army, so close to their borders, presented a long-awaited opportunity to break free of both Turkish and Byzantine dominance. They welcomed Baldwin and his forces with enthusiasm, hailing them as liberators. Today, we are cautious with the word liberation. The Armenians learned that lesson earlier than most. As Baldwin advanced toward the Euphrates, Armenian communities came out to greet him. Remaining Turkish garrisons in the area either fled or were killed by the local Christians. The only significant Turkish leader left nearby was the Emir Balduk of Samosata, who controlled the key road from Edessa to Melitene. He tried to organize a defense, but was unable to take any aggressive action. 2 Armenian nobles, referred to by the Latins as Fair and Nicusus, joined Baldwin with small militias. By the winter of 1097, Baldwin had secured the region as far as the Euphrates, taking control of 2 strategic fortresses, Ravendell and Turbessel. Ravendell, which provided a key communication route to Antioch, was entrusted to Bagrat, while Fair was given command of Turbessel, near the vital Euphrates crossing at Carchemish. Around the new year, while Baldwin remained in Turbessel, an embassy arrived from Edessa. Thurres was growing increasingly anxious as the Franks delayed their advance on the west bank of the Euphrates. His situation was precarious, and news that Kerboga was assembling a vast army en route to Antioch further heightened his concern. That same force could easily crush Edessa and the Armenian territories along the way. Thurres had hoped to hire Baldwin's support through payment and rich gifts, essentially treating him as a mercenary. But Baldwin's ambitions were greater. Now, the Edessian delegation was empowered to offer a more significant proposition. Thurres would adopt Baldwin as his son and heir and immediately share rule with him. This offer was a compromise for Thurres. It wasn't his ideal solution, but with unpopularity at home and pressure from hostile neighbors, he had little choice. Yet some Armenians saw the situation more clearly and grew uneasy. Bagrat, who had mentored Baldwin in Armenian affairs, was among the first to express discontent. While the Franks were still stationed at Turbessel, Fair accused him of conspiring with the Turks. The reality may have been more nuanced. Bagrat was likely consulting with his brother, Koch Vasil, about the rising threat Baldwin now posed to Armenian autonomy. He may have also harbored hopes of ruling Ravendell himself. Baldwin, however, refused to take chances. He swiftly dispatched troops to Ravendell, had Bagrat arrested, and brought him before him to be tortured for information. Bagrat had little to confess and eventually escaped, fleeing to the mountains where Koch Vasil gave him shelter. Eventually, he too would be driven to retreat into the wilderness. In early February 1098, Baldwin departed from Turbessel and made his way toward Edessa, accompanied by only 80 knights. The Turks of Samosata had prepared an ambush at the expected crossing point of the Euphrates, but Baldwin avoided the trap by crossing the river at a more northerly ford. He arrived in Edessa on February 6th, where he was warmly welcomed by Thurres and the entire Christian population of the city. Shortly after his arrival, Thurres officially adopted Baldwin as his son. The ceremony, conducted according to Armenian tradition, was more fitting for a child than for an adult. Baldwin was stripped to the waist, and Thurres donned an oversized shirt, which he pulled over Baldwin's head. The two then pressed their bare chests together to symbolize their new familial bond. Baldwin repeated the same ritual with Thurres' wife, the princess. Now serving as heir and ruler of Edessa, Baldwin recognized that his first objective must be the elimination of the Turkish emirate of Samosata, which posed a constant threat to his western communications. The Edessian population supported the campaign enthusiastically, since Emir Balduk had long been their most persistent enemy, harassing their lands and, at times, demanding tribute from the city itself. Baldwin led the expedition with his knights, joined by the city's militia and Constantine of Gargar, an Armenian noble under Thurres' authority. The campaign took place between February 14th and 20th, but it ended in failure. The local troops proved ineffective in battle and were caught off guard by the Turks, leading to the deaths of 1,000 men. Following this defeat, the army withdrew. Nevertheless, Baldwin managed to capture and fortify a village named St. John, located near the emir's capital. He stationed the majority of his knights there, aiming to restrict Turkish movements. This strategy led to a significant reduction in Turkish raids, and the Armenians readily credited Baldwin for the improved security. Not long after Baldwin's return to Edessa, a conspiracy against Thurres began to unfold, reportedly with the support of Constantine of Gargar. The exact extent of Baldwin's involvement remains unclear. His supporters denied any connection, though the Armenian chronicler Matthew claimed that Baldwin had been informed of the conspirators' plans to remove Thurres and elevate him instead. Thurres was widely disliked by the people of Edessa. Despite his efforts to maintain the city's independence, his association with the Orthodox Church and his status as a nominal Byzantine official made him unpopular. He was also criticized for failing to protect their goods and harvests from Turkish raiders and for imposing heavy taxes. Until Baldwin's arrival, the people had little choice but to tolerate him. Now, with a stronger leader in their midst, they saw the opportunity to replace him. Whether or not the Franks encouraged the plot, it is unlikely that the conspirators would have acted without at least the passive approval of Baldwin and his men. On Sunday, March 7th, the plan was set into motion. The conspirators incited the populace to attack the homes of Thurza's officials, then marched on the citadel where Thurza resided. Abandoned by his guards and receiving no support from Baldwin, Thurza gave in, requesting only that he and his wife be allowed to withdraw safely to her father's home in Melitene. Although Baldwin appeared to guarantee his safety, Thurza was not permitted to leave. Trapped within his palace, he attempted to escape through a window 2 days later, on Tuesday, but was captured by the mob and torn apart. The fate of his wife, Baldwin's adoptive mother, remains unknown. On Wednesday, March 10th, the people of Edessa formally invited Baldwin to take control of the government. Baldwin had successfully realized his goal of securing a principality. Although Edessa was not situated within the Holy Land, a Frankish-controlled territory along the Middle Euphrates could still serve as a strategic buffer for any future Crusader state in Palestine. In terms of broader crusading objectives, Baldwin could justify his actions. However, from a legal standpoint within Christendom, his claim was far less defensible. Edessa had once belonged to the Byzantine Emperor before it was lost to the Turks, which placed it under the terms of the oath Baldwin had sworn at Constantinople. Furthermore, he had seized control by displacing a governor who, at least officially, remained a loyal servant of the empire. But Baldwin had already shown in Cilicia that his oath held little meaning for him. At Edessa, Thurza himself had been willing to surrender his authority without consulting his imperial overlord. Still, Emperor Alexius took note of the incident and would later assert his rights when the opportunity arose. In hindsight, Armenian historians expressed harsh criticism of Baldwin. However, such judgment may have been unfair. Baldwin's treatment of Thurza lacked moral justification, a fact reflected in the uneasy tone of contemporary Latin chroniclers. Yet Thurza himself had once invited the Turkish leader Alphalag to aid him against the Danishmends and later had the man killed. In that instance, however, Thurza had acted to save his city from infidel oppression, and there had been no symbolic act of adoption involved. While Armenian customs treated adoption less formally than Western law, this still does not absolve Baldwin of moral responsibility. That said, the blame does not lie solely with him. It was the Armenians themselves who murdered Thurza and who, almost unanimously, welcomed Baldwin as their new ruler. The Armenian nobles whom the Crusaders would later displace were primarily those who had served the Byzantine Empire. They were resented by their fellow Armenians for their imperial loyalties and, even more so, for having embraced the Orthodox faith. These men, like Thurza and Gabriel, were among the few with the administrative experience necessary to maintain Armenian autonomy along the Euphrates. Yet their own people, driven by hostility toward Byzantium and a willingness to overlook in Latins the very heresies they condemned in Greeks, contributed to their downfall. In the end, it was their misplaced faith in their Frankish allies that led them toward ruin. For the time being, everything appeared to be going well. Baldwin assumed the title of Count of Edessa and made it clear that he intended to govern independently. However, with only a limited number of Frankish soldiers at his disposal, he had no choice but to depend on the support of the local Armenian population. Fortunately, he found several Armenians he could trust, and his task became significantly easier following the discovery of a vast treasure hoard in the citadel. Much of this wealth dated back to Byzantine times and had been increased substantially by Thurza through heavy taxation. This unexpected fortune gave Baldwin the means to both secure loyalty and carry out a brilliant diplomatic move. Alarmed by Baldwin's rise to power, the Emir Balduc of Samosata, seeing new preparations for an assault on his capital, quickly offered to sell his territory for 10,000 bezants. Baldwin accepted the deal and entered Samosata in triumph. Within its citadel, he found many hostages who had been taken from Edessa. He promptly returned them to their families, an act that, combined with the removal of the Turkish threat from the region, greatly boosted his popularity. Balduc was even welcomed to Edessa, along with his personal guard, now serving as mercenaries under Baldwin. As Baldwin's achievements became more widely known, several Western knights who were en route to Antioch decided to divert and join him. Others, weary of the prolonged siege of Antioch, also came to share in his growing fortune. Among these were Drogo of Nesle, Raymond of Toul, and Gaston of Barne, a vassal of Raymond. Baldwin rewarded their service with generous gifts from his treasury and encouraged them to integrate by marrying Armenian noble women. Leading by example, Baldwin took an Armenian bride himself. His new wife was the daughter of a local chieftain referred to in Latin chronicles as Tafnas or Tafrock. This prince owned nearby lands and was possibly related to Constantine of Gargar. He also had ties to Constantinople, where he eventually retired. It's possible he was the same individual as Thatul, ruler of Marash, whose alliance would have been politically valuable to Baldwin. The daughter came with a dowry of 60,000 bezants and a loosely stated promise that she would inherit her father's estates. However, the marriage brought her no joy, and no children resulted from their union. In this way, Baldwin laid the foundations for the policy he would later implement in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Governance would remain firmly in the hands of the Frankish nobility, but people of the East were to be included in the state's administration. Over time, this approach aimed to blend the diverse populations into a unified political entity. While it reflected the vision of a pragmatic statesman, many knights newly arrived from the West saw it as a betrayal of the crusading mission. They had not taken up the cross, inspired by Pope Urban's call at Clermont, only to witness their leaders establish semi-oriental monarchies in distant lands. Baldwin's strategy was not easy to maintain in its early stages. The Muslims viewed him as a temporary figure. Southwest of Edessa, between the city and the Euphrates, lay the Muslim town of Saraj. Though it had once paid tribute to the Ortakid prince Balak ibn Bahram, it had recently rebelled. Balak reached out to Baldwin, proposing to hire him to suppress the revolt. Baldwin, pleased by this new opportunity, agreed to undertake the mission. However, the people of Saraj secretly appealed to Balduc for help. Balduc and his forces quietly left Edessa and were welcomed into Saraj. Baldwin soon followed, bringing siege engines with him. Faced with this show of strength, both Balduc and the residents of Saraj lost their resolve. The townspeople immediately offered to surrender and pay tribute, while Balduc came forward, claiming he had only entered the city to secure it for Baldwin. Baldwin, unconvinced but outwardly accepting the explanation, appeared to forgive him. Yet, a few days later, Baldwin demanded that Balduc surrender his wife and children as hostages. When he hesitated, Baldwin had him arrested and beheaded. A Frankish garrison was then stationed in Saraj under the command of Fulk of Chartres. This incident taught Baldwin a harsh lesson. Muslim allies could not be trusted. From that point on, he ensured that Muslims living within his domain remained without local leadership. Still, he permitted them religious freedom. In a city like Saraj, where the population was overwhelmingly Arab and Muslim, such tolerance was essential. However, this policy of religious tolerance shocked many in the West. The fall of Saraj, followed months later by the capture of Barjik, helped Baldwin secure control over the routes linking Edessa with his other strongholds, Turbisel and Ravendell. This not only solidified his principality, but also ensured reliable communication with the main crusading army. His growing power sent a strong message to Muslim forces, prompting them to focus on eliminating him. This became clear in May when Kerboga, en route to relieve Antioch, paused to try and crush Baldwin. For 3 weeks, he unsuccessfully besieged Edessa before giving up. His failure boosted Baldwin's prestige, and the delay he caused was crucial in aiding the broader crusade. But Baldwin also misjudged his Armenian subjects. They were troubled by the increasing presence of Frankish knights in their lands and resented the privileges Baldwin granted them. The Franks, in turn, treated the Armenians with open contempt and, at times, brutality. The local Armenian elite found themselves shut out of Baldwin's governing council, which was exclusively Frankish and taxes remained as burdensome as they had been under Thurus. Additionally, Armenian lands and rural areas were being distributed to Western newcomers, who imposed strict feudal systems unfamiliar and unwelcome to local farmers. Toward the end of 1098, Baldwin was alerted to a plot against his life, revealed by an Armenian informant. The conspiracy reportedly involved 12 prominent townsmen who had been communicating with Turkish emirs in the Diyarbakir region. At the time, Baldwin's father-in-law, Tafnaz, was staying in Edessa following the recent wedding of his daughter to Baldwin. Rumor had it that the plotters hoped to replace Baldwin with Tafnaz, or at least force Baldwin to share power with him. Upon learning of the scheme, Baldwin acted swiftly. The two main conspirators were arrested and blinded. Others had their noses or feet cut off. Many more were thrown into prison, and their wealth was seized. Yet, like many cautious Easterners, they had hidden their fortunes well. When Baldwin's officials failed to uncover these hidden caches, he permitted the prisoners to purchase their release. Although Tafnaz's involvement could not be proven, he wisely chose to retreat to his mountain territories, distancing himself from his fearsome son-in-law. Along with him, he took most of the dowry promised to Baldwin's wife. Baldwin's harsh suppression of the conspiracy effectively eliminated any further threats from his Armenian subjects. Although he continued to appoint a few of them to prominent roles, he became increasingly indifferent to the native population as more Frankish knights arrived, drawn by his rising fame. Within less than a year of taking control in Edessa, Baldwin's reputation had grown immensely. While the main Crusader army was still struggling on its journey toward Jerusalem, he had already established a prosperous and formidable principality deep within Asia. His name commanded both fear and respect across the Eastern world. Baldwin had embarked on the crusade as the youngest son in his family, without wealth or position, reliant on the support of his brothers. Overshadowed at first by powerful nobles like Raymond of Toulouse, Hugh of Vermandois, and seasoned warriors like Bohemond, Baldwin had now surpassed them all in authority. Among the leaders of the crusade, he had emerged as the most capable and politically astute figure. The city of Antioch is located on the Orontes River, around 12 miles from the Mediterranean coast. It was established in 300 BC by Seleucus I of Syria, who named it in honor of his father. Antioch quickly grew in prominence, becoming the leading city in Asia, and during the Roman Empire, it ranked as the third most important city in the world. For Christians, it held special significance as the place where the followers of Christ were first called Christians and where St. Peter established his first bishopric. By the 6th century AD, Antioch's glory had begun to fade due to a series of devastating earthquakes and a raid by the Persians. Its decline continued after the Arab conquest, which allowed the inland city of Aleppo to rise at its expense. The Byzantines regained control of Antioch in the 10th century, restoring some of its former prestige. It became a key center for trade between the Greeks and Muslims and emerged as the most formidable stronghold on the Syrian frontier. In 1085, the city fell to Suleiman ibn Kutalmish. After his death, control passed to Sultan Malik Shah, who appointed the Turkoman leader Yaghi-Siyan as governor. Yaghi-Siyan had ruled Antioch for 10 years. Although he was nominally under the authority of Emir Ridwan of Aleppo following Malik Shah's death, he largely maintained his independence by playing Ridwan off against his rivals, Dukak of Damascus and Kerboga of Mosul. In 1096, Yaghi-Siyan even betrayed Ridwan during a conflict with Dukak, whom he then acknowledged as his superior. The news of the Crusaders' approach deeply unsettled Yaghi-Siyan. Antioch was their clear target, and the Crusaders could not move south toward Palestine without first securing the city. The majority of Antioch's inhabitants were Christians, while the Syrian Christians, who distrusted both Greeks and Armenians, might have remained loyal. Yaghi-Siyan could not rely on the others. Until this time, he had shown tolerance toward the Christian population. The Orthodox Patriarch, John the Oxite, had been allowed to remain in the city, and its large churches had not been converted into mosques. However, as the crusade drew closer, Yaghi-Siyan began to implement repressive policies. He imprisoned the patriarch the most prominent religious figure in Antioch. Many influential Christians were expelled, and others fled. The Cathedral of St. Peter was desecrated and turned into stables for the emir's horses. In nearby villages, persecution increased, and this led to local Christian villagers massacring Turkish garrisons as soon as the Crusaders appeared. Yaghi-Siyan then began seeking allies. Ridwan of Aleppo refused to help, but Dukak of Damascus responded positively after Yaghi-Siyan's son, Shams ad-Dawla, made a personal appeal. Dukak's Atabeg, the Turkoman leader Token, and the emir Jana ad-Dawla of Homs also pledged their support. Another envoy was sent to Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, who had become the most powerful ruler in Upper Mesopotamia and the Jazira. Kerboga recognized the danger the Crusaders posed to the Muslim world and had ambitions of his own. Capturing Antioch would put Ridwan at his mercy. He began organizing an army to relieve the city and received backing from the sultans of Baghdad and Persia. In the meantime, Yaghi-Siyan gathered a substantial force inside Antioch and began stockpiling supplies to withstand a prolonged siege. The Crusaders entered Yaghi-Siyan's domain at the small town of Marata, where the Turkish garrison fled at the sight of their approach. From there, a force led by Robert of Flanders was dispatched southwest to liberate the town of Arda, whose Christian inhabitants had already killed the garrison stationed there. Meanwhile, on October 20th, the main army reached the banks of the Orontes River at the Iron Bridge, a key crossing where the roads from Arash and Aleppo converged. The bridge was well defended, flanked by 2 towers at its entrance. Despite this, the Crusaders launched an immediate assault. The Bishop of Le Puy directed the operation, and after a fierce clash, they successfully stormed the bridge. Their victory allowed them to seize a massive convoy carrying cattle, sheep, and grain, all intended to supply Yaghi-Siyan's forces. With the way now clear, the Crusaders could see Antioch's formidable citadel rising in the distance. The next day, Bohemond led the vanguard to the city walls, with the rest of the army close behind. The sight of Antioch left the Crusaders in awe. The city's houses and markets sprawled across a plain nearly 3 miles long and 1 mile wide, nestled between the Orontes River and Mount Silpius. Wealthy estates and palaces were scattered across the hillside. Surrounding it all were immense fortifications originally built under Emperor Justinian and recently reinforced by the Byzantines with the most advanced engineering techniques of their time. To the north, the walls rose from marshy ground near the river, while to the east and west they climbed steep slopes of the mountain. On the southern side, the walls ran along the summit of the ridge, spanning a deep gorge carved by the Anopnicles torrent, then crossing a narrow passage known as the Iron Gate, and finally reaching their peak at a majestic citadel towering 1,000 feet above the city. The walls were punctuated by 400 towers, carefully spaced so that every part could be reached by archers. The northeastern gate of St. Paul opened toward the road from the Iron Bridge and Aleppo, while the gate of St. George in the northwest provided access to the road from Lataki and the Lebanese coast. Roads to Alexandretta and the port of St. Simeon, modern-day Swadai, exited the city via a large gate by the river, crossing a fortified bridge. Smaller gates like the Gate of the Duke and the Gate of the Dog offered routes to the river farther east. Inside the city walls, there was a reliable water supply, along with market gardens and pastures for livestock. The space was large enough to house an entire army and sustain it through a prolonged siege. Surrounding the entire city was impossible, as the rugged, steep terrain to the south was too treacherous for any troops to occupy. The Turks had originally captured Antioch in 1085 through betrayal, and it was this same threat of treachery that now haunted Yaghi-Siyan. Though the Crusaders could not completely encircle the city, he lacked enough men to defend every section of the vast walls. Until reinforcements arrived, he could not afford to lose any soldiers. Cautious and uncertain, he made no move to challenge the Crusaders as they took up their positions, and for 2 weeks he refrained from engaging them at all. Upon their arrival, the Crusaders positioned themselves outside the northeastern corner of Antioch's walls. Bohemond established his camp opposite the Gate of St. Paul. Raymond set up across from the Gate of the Dog, and Godfrey stationed himself to Raymond's right, facing the Gate of the Duke. The remaining forces stayed behind Bohemond, ready to move forward wherever needed. At this stage, the bridge gate and the Gate of St. George remained unguarded. Almost immediately, the Crusaders began constructing a bridge of boats to span the river from Godfrey's position to the village of Taranto, where the Muslim cemetery was located. This crossing gave them access to the roads leading to Alexandretta and St. Simeon, and they quickly established a camp north of the river. Yaghi-Siyan had anticipated a swift assault on the city. However, among the Crusader leaders, only Raymond argued for an immediate attack on the walls. He believed that the same divine protection that had brought them this far would also grant them victory. But the others did not share his conviction. The city's massive fortifications were intimidating, their soldiers were exhausted, and the risk of sustaining heavy losses was too great. Moreover, they believed reinforcements would soon arrive. There were even rumors of a Genoese fleet approaching. Bohemond, whose opinions carried the most influence, had personal motivations for opposing Raymond's proposal. He was already envisioning Antioch as his own domain. Not only did he want to avoid seeing the city ransacked by a plundering army, but he also feared that if Antioch were captured through a collective effort, he would be unable to make an exclusive claim to it. He had learned a valuable lesson at Nicaea from Alexius. If the city could be made to surrender directly to him, his claim would be much harder to contest. He believed he could soon arrange this outcome, being somewhat familiar with the art of Eastern intrigue. Under his sway, Raymond's advice was dismissed, deepening the hostility between the two leaders. And so, the best opportunity to quickly seize Antioch was lost. Had the Crusaders launched a successful early assault, Yaghi-Siyan, already on edge, might have mounted little resistance. The delay, however, allowed him to regain his composure. Bohemond and his allies found it easy to establish communication with those inside the city. Christian refugees and exiles maintained regular contact with relatives within Antioch, taking advantage of the gaps in both the Crusader blockade and the city's defenses. As a result, the Crusaders remained well informed about events unfolding inside the walls. But this flow of information went both ways. Many local Christians were ambivalent about whether Byzantine or Frankish rule would be better than Turkish rule. To secure favor with Yaghi-Siyan, some provided him with detailed intelligence on the Crusaders' activities. It was through these informants that Yaghi-Siyan learned of the Crusaders' hesitation to attack. Encouraged by this knowledge, he began organizing sorties. His troops would slip out of the Western Gate to ambush isolated groups of Frankish foragers. He also coordinated with his forces stationed in Rhine, located across the Iron Bridge on the road to Aleppo, urging them to launch attacks on the Crusader rear lines. Around this time, he received word that his son's diplomatic mission to Damascus had been successful. As autumn gave way to winter, the Crusaders began to lose morale, despite achieving a few small victories. In mid-November, Bohemond led an expedition that successfully lured the garrison of Rhine out of their fortress and annihilated them. Around the same time, a Genoese fleet of 13 ships arrived at the port of St. Simeon, which the Crusaders were then able to occupy. The fleet brought additional troops and weapons, responding belatedly to Pope Urban's earlier call to the city of Genoa, made nearly 2 years prior. This development reassured the Crusaders, as they now had a secure line of communication with their homelands by sea. However, these triumphs were soon eclipsed by the growing crisis of food shortages. When the Crusaders first reached the plains surrounding Antioch, they found the area well supplied. Livestock such as sheep and cattle were abundant, and many village granaries still held the recent harvest. With plenty available, they failed to stockpile provisions for the colder months ahead. As supplies dwindled, foraging parties had to travel further afield, exposing themselves to ambushes by Turkish forces descending from the nearby mountains. It was discovered that Turkish raiders were using the Anopnicals Gorge to secretly reach a vantage point above Bohemond's camp, where they would ambush Crusaders returning late. In response, the The leaders agreed to construct a fortified tower on the hill, which each commander would take turns manning. The tower was soon completed and given the name Mauergard. By Christmas, the army's food stores were nearly depleted, and the surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. A council of princes decided to dispatch part of the army under Bohemond and Robert of Flanders to raid villages further up the Orontes Valley near Hama, hoping to seize any remaining supplies. Raymond and the Bishop of Le Puy were left in charge of maintaining the siege. Godfrey was too ill at the time to participate. On December 28th, Bohemond and Robert departed with approximately 20,000 men. Yaghi-Siyan was quickly informed of their movement. Waiting until the force was well out of range, he launched a surprise sortie on the night of December 29th. His troops crossed the bridge and attacked the Crusaders encamped on the north side of the river. The attack took them by surprise, but Raymond reacted swiftly. Gathering a group of knights, he launched a countercharge from the darkness, catching the Turks off guard and forcing them to retreat across the bridge. Raymond pursued them so aggressively that his troops briefly secured a foothold on the other side before the city gates could be closed. At that moment, it seemed Raymond might prove his belief that Antioch could be taken by force. However, a riderless horse, panicked and running wild, plunged into the tightly packed knights on the bridge, throwing their ranks into confusion. In the darkness, chaos spread quickly, and panic set in among the Crusaders. They fled back toward their camp by the boat bridge, with the Turks now chasing them in turn. Eventually, the Crusaders regrouped, and the Turkish forces withdrew to the safety of the city. The skirmish resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, but the losses were particularly severe among the Frankish knights. Among the fallen was the standard-bearer of Edhemer himself. Meanwhile, Bohemond was traveling south with Robert of Flanders, completely unaware of how close Raymond had come to capturing Antioch. Around mid-December, Dukak of Damascus had departed his capital with his Atabeg Token, Yaghi-Siyan's son Shams, and a sizable army. At Hama, they were joined by the local emir and his troops. By December 30th, they had reached Shazer, where they learned that a Crusader force was nearby. They advanced immediately, and the following morning encountered the enemy at the village of Albara. The Crusaders were caught off guard. Robert's forces, slightly ahead of Bohemond's, were nearly encircled. But Bohemond, recognizing the unfolding danger, held most of his troops in reserve and launched a counterattack, just as the Muslims believed they had secured victory. His timely assault rescued Robert and dealt such heavy casualties to Dukak's army that it was forced to retreat back to Hama. Despite claiming victory and having successfully prevented the relief of Antioch, the Crusaders were themselves too weakened to continue foraging. After plundering a few villages and setting a mosque ablaze, they returned to the siege camp nearly empty-handed. Upon their return, they found the camp in a state of despair. The failed battle on the night of the 29th had been followed the next day by a strong earthquake, felt as far away as Edessa, and that evening the sky lit up with the northern lights. In the weeks that followed, torrential rain fell continuously, and the temperatures dropped steadily. Stephen of Blois expressed disbelief that anyone had ever complained about too much sun in Syria. To many, it seemed as though divine wrath had descended upon them. Edhemer of Le Puy declared a 3-day fast as a form of penance, but with famine looming, the fast had little practical effect. The failed foraging mission now meant mass starvation. Soon, 1 out of every 7 men was dying from hunger. Desperate for food, envoys were sent as far as the Taurus Mountains, where the Rupenian princes agreed to offer what little they could. Some aid also came from Armenian monks living in the Amanus Mountains, and local Armenian and Syrian Christians gathered whatever edible supplies they could find to bring to the Crusaders' camp. However, this assistance was driven by profit rather than charity. A single donkey load of food could cost as much as 8 bezants. The horses fared even worse than the men, and by this point, only about 700 remained with the army. A more generous source of support came from the island of Cyprus. Acting likely under Pope Urban's guidance, the Bishop of Le Puy had been diligent in cultivating good relations with the leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church, showing them a level of respect that contradicts the idea that the Pope intended to dominate them through the crusade. For the imprisoned Patriarch of Antioch, locked inside the city, such gestures were of little comfort, as the Turks occasionally placed him in a cage and suspended him over the city walls. But the Patriarch Simeon of Jerusalem, who had fled his position after Ortok's death rendered his city unsafe, was now living in Cyprus. Once communication lines were opened, Edhemer reached out to Simeon. Although Simeon opposed Latin customs, he was willing to cooperate with the Western Church for the greater good of Christendom. Back in October, he had already joined Edhemer in sending a report on the Crusade to Western Christians. Now, upon hearing of the Crusaders' desperate condition, he began regularly sending all the food and wine Cyprus could spare across the sea to aid the army. Despite the generosity of the Patriarch's food shipments, they were not enough to ease the widespread suffering. As hunger intensified, many soldiers began to abandon the camp, either heading toward wealthier regions in search of relief or attempting the long journey home. Initially, only lower-ranking soldiers deserted. But one morning in January, it was discovered that Peter the Hermit himself had fled. William was known to be an opportunist, uninterested in enduring a failing cause. He had already deserted a military venture in Spain. But Peter's loss of courage is more difficult to explain. The two fugitives were soon pursued and captured by Tancred, who returned them in disgrace. Peter, whose reputation was too valuable to jeopardize, was quietly forgiven. William, on the other hand, was made to stand all night in Bohemond's tent and, come morning, was subjected to a stern and threatening reprimand. He swore never to abandon the army again until it reached Jerusalem. With the army shrinking daily due to starvation and desertion, Edhemer determined that a powerful plea for reinforcements must be sent to the west. To lend it the greatest authority, he wrote the appeal in the name of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, whose approval he had presumably secured. The wording of the letter is notable, as it reflects Edhemer's broader approach to church politics. In the letter, the Patriarch speaks to the faithful in the West as the head of all bishops now active in the East. He refers to himself as apostolic and takes the bold step of excommunicating any Christian who breaks their crusading vows. The tone is that of an autonomous religious leader. It would have been impossible for Edhemer to put such words into the mouth of someone intended to be subordinate to the Pope. Regardless of what Urban's long-term vision might have been for the Eastern churches, his legate was clearly not advocating for direct papal dominance. What kind of response the Patriarch's letter received in the West remains unknown. While the Crusaders maintained respectful relations with the Eastern Orthodox Church leaders, their dealings with the political authority of Byzantium began to deteriorate. In early February, the emperor's envoy, Titius, unexpectedly departed from the Crusader camp. He had been accompanying the Crusade since Nicaea, bringing along a small staff and a group primarily made up of engineers and guides. Relations with the Crusader leaders had appeared cordial, and he had been entrusted with control over captured cities at Comnenus and Coxen, acknowledging their military prowess in his reports. Various explanations circulated for his departure, but there is no need to dismiss the account he gave upon returning to Constantinople. According to Titius, Bohemond had summoned him privately once word spread that another Turkish attempt to relieve Antioch was imminent. Bohemond warned him, in confidence, that the other Crusade leaders suspected the emperor of aiding the Turks and were plotting to assassinate Titius in retaliation. Convinced by this warning, and sensing that the army was in no position to capture the fortress, Titius decided to withdraw. His recommendation to starve out Antioch by occupying the surrounding castles had been disregarded. Declaring he needed to return to imperial lands to improve supply logistics, he set sail for Cyprus from the port of St. Simeon. To imply his intention to return, he left most of his staff with the army. But once gone, Bohemond supporters began spreading the rumor that Titius had fled out of cowardice in the face of the Turkish threat. If the emperor's representative had abandoned them so dishonorably, then, they argued, the Crusaders were no longer bound to return Antioch to the empire. Shortly thereafter, Bohemond began hinting that he, too, might leave the army. He claimed that he could no longer ignore his obligations in Italy. Until now, he had played a central role in nearly every military operation, and the thought of losing him during such a critical phase caused considerable alarm within the ranks. He subtly let it be known that being granted control over Antioch would compensate for the sacrifices he was making by remaining. While the other princes saw through his maneuvering, many common soldiers were moved by his apparent sincerity. Meanwhile, Turkish forces were gathering once more to relieve Antioch. When Dukat failed to deliver the promised support, Yaghi-Siyan turned again to his former overlord, Raymond of Aleppo. Regretting his earlier inaction, which had allowed the Crusaders to reach Antioch, Raymond renewed his alliance with Yaghi-Siyan and began organizing a rescue operation. He was joined by his cousin, Sakman the Ortakid of Diyarbakir, and his father-in-law, the Emir of Hama. In early February, the allied Muslim forces reoccupied Harank, using it as their staging ground for an attack on the Crusader encampment. Upon hearing this, the Crusader princes convened in Adhemar's tent, where Bohemond proposed a bold strategy. The infantry would remain behind to guard against any sorties from Antioch, while the remaining knights would launch a surprise attack on the advancing Turks. The plan was approved. On the evening of February 8th, the Frankish cavalry crossed the bridge of boats and positioned themselves between the Orontes River and Lake Antioch, ready to ambush the enemy as they approached the Iron Bridge. At dawn, the Turkish army came into view. The Crusader cavalry launched their first assault before the Turkish archers could organize. Although the initial charge did not break the Turkish formation, the knights withdrew strategically, drawing the enemy toward a narrow strip of land bordered by the lake on one side and the river on the other. This terrain prevented the Turks from using their superior numbers to outflank the Crusaders. There, the knights launched a second, full-force charge. This time, their heavier armor and disciplined formation overwhelmed the more lightly equipped Turks. Chaos spread quickly through the Turkish ranks, and Raymond's entire army collapsed into retreat, fleeing back toward Aleppo. As the retreating soldiers passed through Harank, the garrison there also abandoned the town, which was promptly turned over by the local Christian population to the Crusaders. While the cavalry was securing a dramatic victory, the infantry faced a much tougher challenge. Yaghi-Siyan launched a full-scale sortie against the Crusader camp, and the defenders began to falter. However, in the afternoon, the triumphant knights were seen approaching from a distance. As they drew near, Yaghi-Siyan realized that the relief army had been defeated. He quickly ordered his troops to retreat back within the city walls. Although the defeat of the second relief force boosted Crusader morale, it did little to improve their dire situation. Food remained scarce, despite some supplies now arriving at the port of St. Simeon, mostly from Cyprus. Yet, the road to the coast was frequently targeted by raiders emerging from Antioch, who ambushed small supply convoys. At the same time, Antioch continued to receive provisions via the still unblocked gate of St. George and across the fortified bridge. To secure the bridge and ensure safe passage to St. Simeon, Raymond proposed the construction of a tower on the northern bank nearby. However, the plan stalled due to a shortage of building materials and skilled labor. Then, on March 4th, a fleet manned by English sailors arrived at St. Simeon, commanded by the exiled English Prince Edgar Atheling. The fleet had picked up pilgrims from Italy and had stopped in Constantinople, where Edgar joined them under the authority of the emperor. There, the ships had been loaded with siege equipment and craftsmen. Yet, the Crusaders were careful to ignore the fact that these vital reinforcements had been sent by the emperor. Upon hearing of the fleet's arrival, Raymond and Bohemond decided to travel to the port together to recruit as many fighters as possible and escort the mechanics and supplies back to camp. On March 6th, as they were making their return journey along the road from St. Simeon, they were ambushed by a detachment from the city's garrison. Their forces, caught off guard, panicked and fled, abandoning their cargo to the enemy. A few survivors managed to reach the camp and spread the alarming news that Raymond and Bohemond had been killed. Godfrey, preparing to go out in response, was suddenly faced with a sortie from Antioch. The Turks attacked the camp to provide cover for their returning ambushers, now burdened with stolen supplies. Fortunately, Godfrey's troops were already armed and ready to march toward the coast, allowing them to hold the assault until Raymond and Bohemond, battered but alive, returned with what remained of their troops. Their unexpected arrival, though diminished in strength, gave Godfrey the reinforcements needed to repel the attackers. The leaders then coordinated an effort to intercept the retreating raiders. Their strategy worked perfectly. Laden with plunder, the raiders were quickly outmaneuvered and cut down as they tried to reach the bridge. The valuable construction materials were recovered. It was reported that around 1,500 Turks were killed, many of them drowning while trying to cross the river. Among the dead were 9 emirs. That night, members of the garrison crept out to bury the fallen in the Muslim cemetery on the river's north bank. The Crusaders allowed them to proceed undisturbed. The Crusaders' recent victory enabled them to fully tighten the blockade around Antioch. With the arrival of construction workers and materials, they proceeded to erect a fortress to control access to the fortified bridge. This new stronghold was built near a mosque adjacent to the Muslim cemetery and was formally named the Castle of La Muhammadie, derived from the Old French word for mosque. However, during deliberations over who would command it, Raymond, who had originally proposed its construction, claimed authority over it. As a result, the structure was commonly referred to as Raymond's Castle. Completed by March 19th, it quickly proved effective in cutting off movement through the bridge gate. Nonetheless, the gate of St. George remained unblocked. To address this, the Crusaders resolved to build another castle on a hill opposite the gate, on the site of a former convent. This second fortress was finished in April and entrusted to Tancred, who was granted 300 marks to cover his costs. From that point onward, no food convoys could reach the city, nor could its citizens drive their livestock outside the walls as they had previously done. While small raiding parties could still scale Mount Silpius or slip through the narrow iron gate, large-scale sorties were no longer possible. As hunger began to afflict the city's garrison, the Crusaders saw an improvement in their own supply situation. With the arrival of spring, better weather allowed for safer foraging. Merchants now turned to trade with the Crusader camp, making more food available and lifting the army's morale. Not long after his fortress was completed, Tancred intercepted a large shipment of provisions intended for Yaghi-Siyan, transported by Christian merchants, both Syrian and Armenian. Victories like these gave the Crusaders hope that they could force Antioch into submission through starvation. But they knew time was short, as the fearsome Kerboga of Mosul was assembling his forces. Back in Constantinople, Emperor Alexius had advised the Crusaders to seek some form of agreement with the Fatimids of Egypt. The Fatimids were staunch enemies of the Turks, maintained a relatively tolerant stance toward Christians, and had a history of negotiating with Christian powers. Although the Crusaders likely ignored this advice at the time, an Egyptian delegation arrived at their camp outside Antioch in early spring, sent by Al-Afthal. The Egyptian envoy's proposal appeared to involve a partition of the Seljuk Empire. The Crusaders would take northern Syria, while Egypt would claim Palestine. Al-Afthal, probably viewing the Crusaders as imperial mercenaries, assumed they would agree to such a division, which reflected the territorial boundaries before the Turkish invasions. The Western leaders welcomed the delegation cordially, but refrained from making any firm commitments. The Egyptians stayed in the camp for several weeks before returning home, accompanied by a small Crusader delegation and bearing generous gifts, mostly spoils from the battle on March 6th. These interactions revealed to the Crusaders the potential benefits of playing Muslim factions against each other. Setting aside their religious animosities, they next reached out to Dukak of Damascus upon hearing of Kerboga's mobilization. They requested his neutrality and assured him they had no intentions toward his lands. But Dukak, who viewed his brother Ridwan of Aleppo as his primary rival and had observed Ridwan's return to a stance of neutrality, ultimately declined to support their request. By early May, news reached the Crusaders that Kerboga was advancing. His forces included not only his own men, but also troops contributed by the sultans of Baghdad and Persia, along with contingents from the Ortakid princes of northern Mesopotamia. Ducat of Damascus was poised to join him, and in Antioch, Yaghi-Siyan, though under intense pressure, continued to hold out. Tensions within the Crusader camp mounted. They understood clearly that unless they captured the city before Kerboga arrived, they risked being caught between the city's garrison and the massive relief army. Emperor Alexius was engaged in military operations in Asia Minor, and a desperate appeal was dispatched urging him to come to their aid swiftly. Bohemond, who was determined to claim Antioch for himself, had particular reason to be anxious. Should the emperor arrive before the city fell, or if Kerboga was only defeated with imperial assistance, Bohemond would have no choice but to relinquish Antioch back to Byzantine control. While most of the Crusader leaders were willing to concede the city to Bohemond, Raymond of Toulouse resisted this outcome. The reasons behind Raymond's stance have been widely debated. He was the only prince not formally bound by an oath to the emperor, yet he had left Constantinople on amicable terms with him. More importantly, he deeply distrusted and disliked Bohemond, viewing him as his principal rival for command of the crusade. Raymond and the papal legate Adhemer may also have believed that if the oaths to the emperor were no longer valid, then only the church had the authority to distribute conquered lands. After much negotiation and political maneuvering, a compromise was reached. If Bohemond's forces were the first to enter the city, and if the emperor failed to arrive, he would be granted Antioch. Even with this agreement, Raymond hesitated to fully support it, though Bohemond already felt confident he was on the path to victory. Kerboga's own strategic error gave the Crusaders valuable time. He hesitated to advance on Antioch while a Frankish army remained in Edessa, potentially threatening his right flank. He failed to realize that although Baldwin was too weak to launch an offensive, he was well entrenched in his fortress and not easily dislodged. Kerboga spent the last 3 weeks of May futilely assaulting Edessa's walls, eventually abandoning the effort as not worth the cost or delay. Bohemond used this unexpected pause to full advantage. During this time, he established a secret connection with a captain inside Antioch named Firas. Firas, believed to be an Armenian convert to Islam, had gained a high position within Yaghi-Siyan's administration. Despite his apparent loyalty, Firas harbored resentment toward his commander, who had recently fined him for hoarding grain. Maintaining contact with fellow Christians inside the city, Firas eventually reached an agreement with Bohemond to betray Antioch in exchange for a price. The plan was kept completely confidential. Bohemond shared nothing of it with his peers, choosing instead to publicly highlight the dangers facing the army. By amplifying the sense of peril, he increased the dramatic value of the triumph he was quietly arranging. Bohemond's campaign of persuasion worked all too well. By the end of May, Kerboga had abandoned his fruitless assault on Edessa and resumed his march toward Antioch. As his army approached, panic gripped the Crusader camp. Deserters began to leave in such large numbers that any effort to halt them proved futile. Finally, on June 2nd, a sizable group of northern French troops fled toward Alexandretta, led by Stephen of Blois. Just 2 months earlier, Stephen had written confidently to his wife from the Crusader encampment, describing both the hardships of the siege and the celebrated victory of March 6th, proudly highlighting his own role in the campaign. But now, with Antioch still untaken and Kerboga's forces closing in, he saw staying as a death sentence. Known more for diplomacy than military prowess, Stephen decided to leave while he still could. Among all the princes, Stephen had been the most vocal in his admiration for the Byzantine emperor. Bohemond likely took quiet satisfaction in seeing him go. What he couldn't predict, however, was how Stephen's departure would soon work in his favor. Had Stephen delayed his escape just a few hours, he may have made a different choice. That very day, Firas sent word through his son that he was ready to commit his act of betrayal. Rumors would later claim that Firas had wavered until the night before, when he learned his wife had been unfaithful with a Turkish colleague. Firas now held command over the Tower of the Two Sisters and the adjacent section of the city wall, directly across from Tancred's position. He urged Bohemond to stage a diversion, assemble the army in the afternoon and march eastward, as though preparing to intercept Kerboga. Then, under cover of darkness, the Crusaders would quietly return to the western side of the city, carrying ladders to scale the walls near Firas's post. As a sign of good faith, Firas promised to send his son as a hostage that evening. Bohemond accepted the plan. As evening approached, he instructed a foot soldier named Male Couron to pass through the camp as a herald, announcing that the army would depart at sunset for a raid into enemy-held territory. He then summoned the leading princes and, for the first time, revealed his secret plan. Tonight, Bohemond declared, "If God is with us, Antioch will be ours." If Raymond harbored any jealousy, he kept it to himself. He and the others pledged their full support to the operation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Crusader army set off toward the east. The cavalry rode through the valley in front of Antioch, while the infantry trudged along the hill paths behind. Inside the city, the Turks watched their departure and, expecting an uneventful night, lowered their guard. But around midnight, orders were quietly issued for the entire army to reverse course and move toward the western and northwestern walls. Just before dawn, Bohemond's men reached the Tower of the Two Sisters. A ladder was propped against the wall, and 60 knights began climbing, led by Fulk of Chartres. One by one, they scaled the tower and slipped through a high window into a chamber where Firas nervously waited. Seeing how few had arrived, he exclaimed in Greek, "So few Franks! Where is Bohemond?" But his concern was premature. From the Tower of the Two Sisters, the knights quickly secured 2 adjacent towers also under Firas's command, allowing more ladders to be raised along the intervening wall sections. Meanwhile, an Italian foot soldier ran to inform Bohemond that it was time to enter the city. Though the ladder broke behind him, Bohemond managed to climb up. Some of the Crusaders raced along the ramparts, surprising the guards at their posts, while others descended into the streets to rally the Christian population. With their help, they opened both the gate of St. George and the large bridge gate, through which the bulk of the army was waiting to flood in. The Crusaders now poured into Antioch with minimal resistance. Greeks and Armenians joined them in slaughtering the Turks they encountered, including Firas's own brother. Amid the chaos, some Christians were also accidentally killed. Yaghi-Siyan, awakened by the tumult, quickly realized that the city was lost. With his bodyguard, he fled on horseback through the gorge toward the Iron Gate and out into the hills. His son, Shams ad-Dawla, however, remained composed. He rallied a group of men and reached the citadel before the Franks could intercept him. Bohemond gave chase, but was unable to breach the stronghold, so he hoisted his purple banner atop the highest point he could reach. Its appearance in the morning sunlight uplifted the spirits of the Crusaders still streaming into the city below. Once he had gathered enough men, Bohemond launched a direct assault on the citadel, but it failed, and he was wounded in the process. Many of his troops abandoned the effort, turning instead to looting the city. Bohemond was soon presented with the head of Yaghi-Siyan, delivered by an Armenian peasant. The Turkish commander had been thrown from his horse along a mountain path, abandoned by his escort, and left dazed and defenseless. A group of Armenians found and recognized him. They killed him immediately. One brought Bohemond his head and received a generous reward, while others sold his ornate belt and scimitar sheath for 60 bezants each. By the evening of June 3rd, no Turk remained alive in Antioch. Even Turks in nearby villages, untouched by the Crusaders, had fled in fear, seeking refuge with Kerboga. The homes of both Muslim and Christian residents were ransacked. Treasures and weapons were looted or recklessly destroyed. The streets were littered with rapidly decaying bodies, victims of the massacre and the scorching summer heat. Yet, despite the bloodshed and devastation, Antioch was once again in Christian hands.